Hey guys, before we begin, I want you to get comfortable. Sit or lay down, dim the lights, and then let's begin. You can also let us know in the comments where in the world you currently are and what time it is for you. If you've ever complained about your apartment's heating in winter, spare a thought for our medieval ancestors who faced the cold with nothing more than their wits and a whole lot of wool. Life back then was a game of survival, especially when the winter winds came knocking and central heating was as fictional as a dragon. So how did folks back then avoid turning into human popsicles? Let's dive into the medieval mindset and explore some surprisingly clever, if not always comfortable ways they managed to stay warm. First off, let's talk insulation. Forget double-glazed windows and draft excluders. Medieval homes were all about thick walls and tiny windows. Stone and timber were the building materials of choice, and while they weren't exactly cozy, they were excellent at keeping out the chill. Straw was the unsung hero of insulation, packed between walls and even strewn across floors to trap heat. Imagine your home filled with hay. If nothing else, it would make for an interesting conversation starter. Now, for those who think the more, the merrier is just a phrase for parties, medieval folks took it quite literally when it came to sleeping arrangements. Communal sleeping wasn't just a cozy custom, it was a necessity. A family, or even entire villages in dire times, would huddle together for warmth under layers of blankets and furs. Think of it as the original weighted blanket, but with added snoring and the occasional elbow to the ribs. This might sound like a recipe for a viral Pinterest board today, but back then it was all about body heat and survival. For those who could afford it, there were a few more luxurious options. Enter the bed warmer, a metal pan filled with hot coals and placed under the covers to preheat the sheets. A practical solution, yes, but with a whiff of danger. Imagine the medieval insurance claims when one of these contraptions went rogue. Still, it was a small price to pay for a toasty bed in a drafty castle. Speaking of price, a typical bed warmer would set you back a few pennies, affordable but not exactly pocket change for the average peasant. While today's fashionistas might scoff at woolen sleepwear, in the medieval era it was the height of nighttime chic. Sleeping in your day clothes was common, especially since undressing in freezing temperatures wasn't exactly appealing. Wool was the fabric of necessity, prized for its warmth and availability. Imagine slipping into bed in layers of woolen tunics and leggings, feeling like a human sheep, though to be fair, they were probably warmer than some of today's designer pajamas. Of course, these medieval strategies weren't just about comfort, they were about survival. Winters were harsh, and without modern amenities, staying warm was a matter of life and death. People had to get creative, using every resource available to them. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. And for all our modern conveniences, there's something to be said for the simple ingenuity of using what you've got to make it through the night. As we marvel at the resilience of our medieval ancestors, it's worth debunking a few myths. The romantic notion of the noble peasant, huddled by the fire in rustic contentment, is more fantasy than fact. In reality, life was a gritty battle against the elements, with people doing whatever it took to stay alive. It's easy to romanticize the past, but the truth is, they didn't choose to live this way. They had to. So next time you're curling up under a quilt, spare a thought for those who didn't have it so easy. Maybe even toss an extra blanket on the bed in their honor. After all, a little extra warmth never hurt anyone, unless, of course, it involves a rogue bed warmer. Stay tuned for more medieval escapades and the ingenious ways our ancestors kept the cold at bay. As we leave behind the woolly embrace of medieval sleeping arrangements, let's sink our teeth into another essential survival skill for those braving the bone-chilling weather: nutrition. You see, surviving a medieval winter wasn't just about staying warm, it was also about keeping bellies full when the ground turned into a frozen wasteland. Enter the medieval pantry, a place where practicality trumped Pinterest aesthetics and preservation techniques were as crucial as the food itself. First on the menu is the humble root cellar, a marvel of medieval ingenuity that modern preppers would drool over. Imagine it as a natural refrigerator, ingeniously designed to keep root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and potatoes from turning into mush before spring. These subterranean storage spaces took advantage of the Earth's natural insulation, maintaining a consistent temperature that was perfect for preserving food. Think of it as nature's very own Tupperware, minus the burp seal. A root cellar was an investment in survival, an insurance policy against the unpredictable whims of the medieval climate. Now, let's talk seasonal eating habits, a concept that's all the rage today among the health-conscious crowd. But back in the Middle Ages, it wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. When the market stalls were covered in snow and the fields lay dormant, your diet was whatever you had managed to squirrel away during the bountiful months. Preserved meats, dried fruits and pickled vegetables were the stars of the winter menu. Salted pork might not sound like a delicacy, but when it's that or nothing, you'd be amazed how quickly your taste buds adapt. Speaking of adaptation, let's debunk a common myth. The medieval peasant wasn't just gnawing on dry bread and dreaming of roast chicken. While meat was a luxury, the average diet was surprisingly varied and included grains, legumes, and the occasional fish if you lived near a river. Bread was indeed a staple, but it came in various forms, from the humble barley loaf to the more refined wheat bread, depending on your social status. And let's not forget pottage, a thick stew brimming with whatever vegetables and grains were at hand. It was the ultimate comfort food, minus the Instagram filter. Now, let's take a moment to chuckle at how medieval diets would fit into today's wellness trends. Imagine a 1400s version of a keto diet, where carbs were king and kale smoothies would have been met with blank stares. Kale, after all, was considered fodder for animals, not the superfood it is today. And while we're on the topic of greens, let's address the romanticized notion of the medieval herb garden. While they did exist, these gardens were more about medicinal uses than culinary flair. Peppermint tea for a cold? Sure. A kale cleanse? Not so much. Economic context was crucial in shaping these eating habits. The feudal system meant that peasants often had limited access to the fruits of their labour, quite literally. The lord of the manor would claim the best produce, leaving the scraps for the serfs. It was a system that ensured the wealthy stayed plump through winter, while the poor, well, didn't. But within this harsh reality, there was a community spirit that saw people sharing what little they had, a survival tactic as old as time. In the midst of this culinary juggling act, preservation was the name of the game. Smoking, salting, and drying were the holy trinity of food storage methods. A hunk of salted meat hanging in the larder was more than dinner. It was a promise that your family would make it through to spring. And lest we forget, beer and ale were the hydration heroes, safer to drink than often contaminated water and chock full of those all-important calories. Not quite a balanced diet, but it did the trick. As we marvel at these medieval survival strategies, let's not get too swept away by the romance of it all. Sure, there's something appealing about the idea of living off the land, but the reality was much grimmer than any slow-motion montage would have you believe. The threat of famine was never far away, and a bad harvest could mean the difference between a lean winter and a deadly one. So, as we sip our turmeric lattes and nibble on avocado toast, let's give a nod to the ingenuity and tenacity of our medieval ancestors. They didn't have the luxury of choice, but they made do with what they had, and in doing so laid the groundwork for the culinary traditions we tweak and rebrand today. Stay tuned as we continue to dig deeper into the past, unearthing more tales of survival and the clever, if not slightly desperate, ways our forebears kept hunger at bay when the world outside was frozen solid. As we leave behind the culinary creativity of medieval survival, it's time to dive into another crucial aspect of staying alive, when the world around you was anything but hospitable: medicine. Now, if you think modern medicine can be hit or miss, brace yourself for a trip back to the Middle Ages, where healthcare could mean anything, from a soothing herbal poultice to a full-on bloodletting extravaganza. Let's start with the herbal remedies, the medieval equivalent of today's natural health store, but with a bit more dirt and a lot less regulation. Back then, herbs like sage, thyme, and rosemary weren't just for seasoning your Sunday roast, they were the backbone of medieval medicine. In fact, the famous medieval text, the Leech Book of Bald, from the 9th century, lists these herbs and many others as cures for ailments ranging from headaches to more, shall we say, intimate issues. While some of these natural concoctions had real medicinal properties, others were more about faith than science. After all, when you're sick in a world where germs are as invisible as phantoms, a little placebo effect goes a long way. But let's not underplay the economic context here. These herbal treatments were often the only option for the average peasant who couldn't afford the more exotic ingredients or the services of a physician. And speaking of physicians, let's talk about the rock stars of medieval medicine, the barbers. Yes, you heard that right. These guys were the Swiss Army knives of the health world, cutting hair by day and performing surgery by night. Need a tooth pulled? Call the barber. Want to get rid of a pesky wart? Barber. Feeling a bit off and think a bit of bloodletting might do the trick? Yep, it's the barber again. It's a miracle anyone survived a haircut back then, let alone an appendectomy. The practice of bloodletting deserves its own moment in the spotlight, or perhaps in the shadows, given its rather grim nature. The idea was simple. If you were sick, it must be because you had too much blood. So, obviously, the solution was to drain some out. Leeches were the tool of choice here. And while this sounds like the kind of thing reserved for horror movies, it was a serious medical practice. But don't let the creepiness fool you. Leeches actually did some good thanks to their anticoagulant saliva, which can increase blood flow in certain conditions. In fact, leeches are still used in modern medicine today, albeit in a much more controlled environment and with a lot less screaming. Now, let's bust a few myths about medieval hygiene practices, or the lack thereof. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people weren't exactly rolling around in filth 24/7. Bathing was more common than you might think, especially among the wealthy. Public bathhouses were a thing, and people did use them, though often more for socializing than scrubbing. The big issue was that too much bathing was thought to open the pores to disease, which is why some folks were more inclined to dab at their faces with a damp cloth than hop into a tub. And while it's easy to laugh at the notion of a medieval health spa, remember that these practices were about balancing the humours, a medical theory that dominated for centuries. It's a classic case of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, except in this case, it was very much broken. Speaking of broken, let's not forget the medieval approach to surgery. With no anaesthesia beyond a stiff drink and a sturdy stick to bite on, it's a wonder anyone survived the operating table. Surgical instruments were often just repurposed tools from the kitchen or the blacksmith's forge. Imagine a blacksmith's tongs being used to extract a tooth, and you'll have some idea of the horror. But credit where it's due, medieval surgeons did the best they could with what they had, and some of their techniques, like trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure, were surprisingly advanced. The economic and social structures of the time played a huge role in access to these medical marvels, or missteps, as it were. The wealthy had better access to trained physicians and exotic remedies, while the poor made do with what they could find or grow. It's a stark reminder that while the medieval world was full of communal spirit, it also had its share of inequality. The lords lived in relative comfort, while their serfs were left to the whims of fate and whatever herbal concoction they could whip up. As we marvel at the resilience of our forebears, it's worth noting that despite the dubious methods, medieval medicine wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. Some practices laid the groundwork for modern science. The study of anatomy advanced considerably during this time, albeit mostly in secret, thanks to the Church's restrictions on dissection. But knowledge is a persistent pest, and scholars found ways to learn and share information despite the risks. So next time you're popping a pill for a headache or complaining about the wait at your local doctor's office, spare a thought for those medieval folks who made do with leeches, barber surgeons, and herbal brews. And maybe give a little nod to the past next time you sip on some peppermint tea. It might not cure what ails you, but it's a comforting connection to a time when medicine was as much about hope as it was about healing. Stay tuned as we continue our journey through the trials and tribulations of medieval life, exploring the ways people navigated a world where survival was a daily challenge and innovation was born of necessity. Before we dive into the medieval social safety net, which was more of a cobbled-together rope bridge than a modern social security system, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer grit required to navigate feudal society. Picture a world where your social status was as fixed as a medieval fortress wall, and moving up was about as likely as a dragon inviting you over for tea. But, for all its rigid hierarchy, the medieval world had its own ingenious ways of ensuring survival, though not without its fair share of pitfalls. At the heart of this system was the feudal contract, a sort of medieval handshake that bound lords and vassals in a relationship as complex as any modern soap opera. In essence, the lord provided land, protection, and justice, though justice often had a flexible definition depending on the lord's mood and how much wine he'd consumed. In return, the vassal, often a knight or lesser noble, pledged loyalty and military service. Think of it as the original benefits package, with the catch being that your life was on the line, quite literally. But what about the peasants, the backbone of this agrarian world? They were the ones toiling in the fields, their hands calloused from back-breaking labour, yet crucial to the entire social structure. Peasants worked the land in exchange for protection and a place to live, although protection might be a generous term when your village could be raided by rival lords or pillaged during a dispute. Let's not sugarcoat it, life for these folks was tough, their days dictated by the seasons and the whims of their overlords. Now let's address a common myth, that of the idyllic village life, where peasants lived in rustic harmony, singing folk songs as they tilled the fields. Romantic, yes. Accurate, not so much. The reality was a constant struggle against nature, famine, and, occasionally, their own lords. Feudal obligations meant that peasants were often at the mercy of their rulers, who could demand taxes or labour on a whim. In a particularly harsh twist, a bad harvest didn't just mean hunger. It meant owing your lord grain you didn't have, a debt that could spiral into a nightmare. Despite these challenges, the sense of community was vital. Villages were tight-knit, with everyone relying on each other for survival. In a world without modern conveniences, your neighbour was your lifeline, not just someone to borrow sugar from. This communal spirit extended to the open field system, where land was shared and worked collectively. While this meant less individual freedom, it offered a safety net of sorts, distributing risk across the community. If one field failed, others could compensate, a medieval version of not putting all your eggs or turnips in one basket. And let's not forget the guilds, the medieval answer to trade unions. These were groups of skilled craftsmen and artisans who banded together to protect their livelihoods. Joining a guild was like getting a golden ticket to economic stability, offering training, support, and a network that could make or break your career. It was LinkedIn for the medieval set, minus the endless inbox of connection requests. However, guild membership wasn't free. Aspiring members underwent rigorous apprenticeships, sometimes lasting up to 7 years, and often had to produce a masterpiece to prove their worth. Talk about a high-stakes job interview. But while guilds provided economic security, they also enforced strict rules, stifling innovation in favour of maintaining standards. A double-edged sword, if ever there was one. For every craftsman who thrived within the system, there were others who chafed under its restrictions, their creativity constrained by guild regulations. This tension between tradition and innovation is a tale as old as time, and one that played out in the workshops and marketplaces of medieval Europe. While the feudal system offered a semblance of order and security, it also perpetuated deep social divides. The hierarchy was entrenched, with the nobility enjoying privileges far beyond the reach of the average serf. Yet, within these confines, people found ways to navigate and sometimes even subvert the system. The church, for example, held immense power and wealth, often rivaling that of kings. It provided charity and education, becoming a beacon of hope for many. However, it also demanded tithes and sometimes exploited its followers' faith to amass wealth and influence. It's a classic case of give and take, with the church offering spiritual salvation while filling its coffers. Yet, for all its flaws, the church provided a sense of community and continuity in an unpredictable world. Monasteries became centres of learning and preservation of knowledge, their libraries a treasure trove of ancient texts that would one day fuel the Renaissance. So, while the church's role was complex, it was undeniably central to medieval life, a paradox of piety and power. As we peel back the layers of medieval society, it's clear that survival was a group effort, a delicate dance of duty and obligation. The feudal system, with all its inequities, knitted communities together, creating a patchwork quilt of allegiances and responsibilities. It was a world where your word was your bond, and breaking it had consequences as severe as losing your land or your head. But, as with any system, cracks were inevitable. The Black Death, a pandemic that swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, was a brutal leveller, decimating populations and upending the social order. With so many dead, labour became scarce, giving surviving peasants newfound bargaining power. It was a shift that foreshadowed the slow unravelling of feudalism, as people began to question their place in the societal hierarchy and seek better opportunities in burgeoning towns and cities. So, as we marvel at the resilience of our medieval ancestors, Let's remember that their world was one of contrasts, where community coexisted with hierarchy, and survival often depended on navigating the complex web of social obligations. It was a time of great hardship and great ingenuity, a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of adversity. Stay with us as we continue to unravel the threads of history, exploring the ways people adapted and thrived in a world where life was as unpredictable as the weather and just as unforgiving. As we continue to untangle the fascinating tapestry of medieval life, it's time to step back and consider the bigger picture, because if there's one thing our medieval ancestors had in spades, it was resilience. These folks didn't just survive, they thrived in a world where every day was like an episode of Survivor, without the cameras or the luxury of voting someone off the island. Their lives were a masterclass in making the most of what little they had, proving that necessity truly is the mother of invention. Take, for instance, the medieval approach to resourcefulness. People back then had a knack for repurposing everything, long before upcycling became a trendy hashtag. If you needed to fix a broken tool, you didn't just toss it out, you repaired it, often with whatever odds and ends you had on hand. A cracked wooden spoon might become a patch for a hole in your roof, and a tattered tunic could be transformed into a makeshift sack for storing grain. This was the original zero-waste lifestyle, driven not by eco-consciousness, but by sheer necessity. Moreover, medieval folks were the ultimate minimalists, partly by choice and largely by circumstance. Their homes were sparse, with only the essentials. Think a bed, a few cooking pots, and perhaps a treasured heirloom or two. Their wardrobes were equally modest, with garments that were mended and passed down through generations. In a world where materials were scarce and labor was intensive, every possession was cherished and maintained with care. It's a poignant reminder that sometimes less is more, a lesson that resonates in today's world of overconsumption and clutter. But let's not romanticize this too much. The harsh reality was that medieval life required constant adaptation to an ever-changing environment. Weather could make or break a year, and while they didn't have the luxury of a 5-day forecast, medieval people were keen observers of nature. They read the skies and the behavior of animals to predict the coming seasons, a skill that was as crucial as it was unreliable. And while we might laugh at the image of a medieval farmer gazing at a cloudy sky with a furrowed brow, it's not too far removed from our own obsession with weather apps and the perpetual small talk about rain or shine. Speaking of weather and who doesn't love a good weather gripe, it's worth noting that medieval folks were experts at complaining about it. In fact, written records from the period are peppered with laments about unseasonable frosts or relentless rain. It's a comforting thought, really, to know that some things, like grumbling about the weather, are a timeless human tradition. If anything, it highlights our shared humanity, bridging the centuries with a collective sigh of exasperation at Mother Nature's whims. Now, if we draw a parallel to modern survivalism, the connections are as striking as they are instructive. Today's survivalists and preppers have taken a page out of the medieval playbook, embracing skills that have been honed over centuries. From foraging and gardening to building shelters and conserving resources, the methods may have evolved, but the principles remain the same. It's about self-sufficiency and resilience, traits that served our ancestors well and continue to be invaluable today. The modern minimalist movement also owes a debt to medieval living. The idea that happiness doesn't stem from material wealth, but from meaningful experiences and community, is something medieval people knew all too well. They lived in close-knit communities where cooperation was essential and social bonds were a lifeline. It's a stark contrast to today's individualistic society, where many are rediscovering the joy of simplicity and connection, often through movements like minimalism and intentional living. But let's not forget the darker side of medieval resilience, the stark inequalities that defined the era. The feudal system, with its rigid class structures, meant that while some thrived, others struggled to survive on the fringes. Yet, even within this framework, there were moments of resistance and ingenuity. The rise of the merchant class in the later medieval period, for instance, challenged the traditional order and laid the groundwork for the economic systems we know today. It was a slow, often painful shift, but one that underscored the human capacity for adaptation and change. As we wrap up this journey through the medieval mindset, it's clear that these ancient survival techniques offer more than just historical curiosity. They remind us of the importance of resilience, adaptability, and community values that are as relevant now as they were 1,000 years ago. So, the next time you find yourself grumbling about the weather or wondering how to make do with less, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They navigated a world of uncertainty with ingenuity and grit, forging a legacy of survival that echoes through time. In the end, the story of medieval survival is one of enduring human spirit, a testament to our ability to persevere against the odds. It's a reminder that while the world may change, the fundamental challenges of life remain remarkably consistent, and perhaps, in understanding the trials and triumphs of those who came before us, we can find inspiration and insight for our own journeys through the unpredictable landscape of life. So here's to our medieval forebears, the ultimate survivors, whose lessons continue to guide us in ways both profound and practical, long after their world has faded into history. In the bustling city of Tangier, there was a young man who probably thought his hometown was a bit too small for his grand ambitions. Meet Ibn Battuta, a 21-year-old with a healthy case of wanderlust back in 1325. While most of us might contemplate a gap year or a semester abroad, Ibn Battuta decided to embark on what was supposed to be a 16-month pilgrimage to Mecca. Spoiler alert, it turned into a 30-year global odyssey. Talk about the ultimate detour. Now, let's dig into the why and how of this epic journey. To put it mildly, the 14th century was a time when the world was both larger and smaller than we might imagine today. Larger because travel was glacially slow compared to our jet-setting standards, and smaller because the medieval Islamic world was remarkably interconnected. Think of it as the original globalization, minus the internet and fast food. Ibn Battuta was born into a Berber family in Tangier, a city that was already a vibrant hub of cultures, commerce, and more languages than you could shake a stick at. The social and economic climate was just ripe for adventure. The Dar al-Islam, or the Islamic world, stretched from Spain to India, providing a vast network of relatively safe routes and accommodations for travelers. Coincidentally, it was also a time when the idea of traveling for knowledge and spiritual enlightenment had both religious and social prestige. Perfect for a young scholar like Ibn Battuta. Economically, the 14th century was a roller coaster ride. Europe was in the throes of the Black Death, but the Islamic world was thriving. Trade routes were buzzing, and cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad were the Silicon Valleys of their time, minus the overpriced coffee. This economic prosperity meant that if you were smart or lucky enough to hitch a ride with a caravan, you could travel extensively without breaking the bank. Ibn Battuta had the brains, and he was about to test his luck. But let's not kid ourselves. Ibn Battuta set off with no travel insurance, no GPS, and no Lonely Planet guidebook. His only guide was faith, and maybe a few questionable maps. The reality of medieval travel was far from the romantic notion of a leisurely stroll through exotic lands. We're talking about camel caravans, bandits, and the constant risk of disease. Yet, the lure of the road was too strong. His first stop? A little pilgrimage to Mecca, or Hajj, which was a common rite of passage for devout Muslims. On June 14, 1325, Ibn Battuta bid farewell to his family, likely giving them the medieval equivalent of, "Don't worry, I'll be back soon." As he set out, he joined the ranks of countless pilgrims who had made the journey to Mecca for centuries. The Hajj was not just a spiritual journey, it was the original social networking event. Pilgrims from all corners of the Islamic world converged, sharing news, ideas, and occasionally some questionable cooking. The practicalities of this journey were daunting. Ibn Battuta's route would take him through the Maghreb, across the North African coast. Picture vast stretches of nothingness, dotted with the occasional oasis. It's hot, it's dusty, and you're sharing the road with a motley crew of traders, scholars, and fellow pilgrims. A good day might involve covering about 20 miles, if the camels were feeling cooperative. And let's not forget the occasional sandstorm, because nature loves to spice things up. Now, you might wonder how Ibn Battuta managed to finance this escapade. Good question. The short answer? Resourcefulness and a whole lot of bartering. He was a trained qadi, or Islamic judge, which meant he could offer legal services wherever he went. It was a time when being a scholar was a ticket to free lodging and meals, assuming you didn't mind the occasional flea-infested bed or dubious stew. As Ibn Battuta travelled eastward, The landscape and cultures changed, but the quest remained the same. The early days of his journey were a test of endurance, both physical and mental. It's easy to romanticize the past, but imagine trekking through the desert in your 20s, far from home, armed only with your wits and an unyielding sense of purpose. He was driven by a thirst for knowledge, a devotion to his faith, and perhaps a bit of youthful arrogance. In hindsight, Ibn Battuta's decision to leave Tangier was the medieval equivalent of quitting your day job to chase a dream. A risky move, no doubt, but one that would ultimately make him one of history's most famous travellers. His journey was anything but ordinary, filled with unexpected turns and larger-than-life experiences. As he ventured further into the unknown, he was about to learn that the world was a much more complicated and fascinating place than he had ever imagined. As Ibn Battuta continued his journey eastward, he wasn't just moving through space, he was navigating a living, breathing tapestry of culture, commerce, and chaos. His next major stop was Cairo, a city that, even in the 14th century, was as vibrant and densely populated as a modern metropolis, minus the skyscrapers. Picture a place teeming with merchants hawking spices, scholars debating philosophy in the bustling madrasas, and the occasional street performer trying to make a few dirhams. Cairo was the New York City of the medieval world, only with more camels and fewer pretzels. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before reaching Cairo, Ibn Battuta had to traverse North Africa, a region that was as diverse as it was daunting. The Maghreb wasn't just a geographical barrier, it was a gauntlet of shifting sand dunes, stony plateaus, and, of course, the infamous bureaucracy of medieval travel. If you think modern airports are bad, try dealing with a caravan of camels and a handful of sultans' checkpoints demanding papers. Ibn Battuta's journey through this region was a masterclass in patience and adaptability, two traits any seasoned traveller would recognize. As he made his way through the deserts and oases, Ibn Battuta was often at the mercy of the caravans. These were the medieval equivalent of budget airlines, cheap, crowded, and prone to unexpected delays. A sandstorm could ground a caravan for days, leaving travellers with nothing to do but swap stories or, more likely, grumble about the weather. And don't let the romantic notion of a camel ride fool you. These creatures are the original grumpy travellers, known for spitting, biting, and an uncanny ability to sit down at the least opportune moments. It's no wonder Ibn Battuta often found himself contemplating the wisdom of his choices, much like any traveller stuck on a layover with no Wi-Fi. By the time he reached Cairo, Ibn Battuta had already learned a thing or two about the importance of networking. Cairo was a hub in every sense of the word, a crossroads where Africa met the Middle East, and trade routes connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. It was a city where you could find anything from the finest silk to the latest intellectual debates. For a young scholar like Ibn Battuta, it was an academic candy store. The city's madrasas were filled with scholars from across the Islamic world, and the libraries were veritable treasure troves of knowledge. It was here that Ibn Battuta could exchange ideas, learn new legal rulings, or simply marvel at the grandeur of the Sultan's court. But while Cairo was a city of opportunity, it was also a city of contrasts. The wealth generated by trade was evident in the opulent palaces and bustling markets, but so was the stark reality of poverty. For every merchant striking it rich on spices or textiles, there were countless labourers struggling to make ends meet. This economic disparity was a reminder that prosperity in the medieval world was as uneven as it is today. Ibn Battuta's own fortunes fluctuated throughout his travels, depending on the generosity of patrons and the success of his legal services. After soaking in the sights and sounds of Cairo, Ibn Battuta set his sights on Alexandria, another jewel of the Mediterranean. If Cairo was the brain of the Islamic world, Alexandria was its heart, a city steeped in history and a melting pot of cultures. By the 14th century, Alexandria was a bustling port city, a place where East met West and traders from Europe rubbed shoulders with those from Africa and Asia. The city's famous lighthouse, the Pharos, may have been reduced to ruins by Ibn Battuta's time, but its legacy as a beacon of knowledge lived on. Scholars and scientists frequented Alexandria, drawn by its rich intellectual heritage and the promise of new discoveries. In Alexandria, Ibn Battuta encountered the tomb of the renowned scholar and spiritual guide Sheikh Abul Abbas al-Mursi. The tomb was a pilgrimage site in its own right, attracting devotees from across the Islamic world. It was a reminder of the deep spiritual currents that ran through Ibn Battuta's journey, a quest not just for worldly knowledge, but for spiritual enlightenment. Yet, Alexandria was also a city of trade and commerce, a place where goods flowed as freely as ideas. The port was a hive of activity, with ships arriving from Venice, Genoa, and beyond, laden with cargoes that fueled the city's economy. From Alexandria, Ibn Battuta's path led him to Damascus, a city renowned for its beauty and cultural wealth. If Alexandria was the heart, Damascus was the soul of the Islamic world. Nestled in the fertile lands of the Levant, Damascus was a city of gardens and palaces, a place where the scent of blooming jasmine hung in the air. It was also a city of faith, with its Umayyad mosque standing as a testament to the architectural prowess of the Islamic Golden Age. For Ibn Battuta, Damascus was a place to rest and reflect, but also to engage with the vibrant intellectual life that flourished in its streets. Once in Damascus, Ibn Battuta found himself amidst a bustling hub of trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Silk Road. The city's markets were a kaleidoscope of colours and sounds, with merchants selling everything from Persian carpets to Indian spices. It was a place where cultures collided, where a traveller could hear a dozen languages in the span of a single block. But amid this tapestry of commerce, there were also the inevitable frustrations of medieval travel bureaucratic red tape, inflated prices, and the occasional unscrupulous merchant trying to make a quick buck off a weary traveller. Ibn Battuta's journey through these cities was not just a physical voyage, but an exploration of the interconnected world of the 14th century. It was a world where borders were porous, where cultures mingled, and where the flow of ideas was as important as the flow of goods. The bustling trade routes of North Africa were the arteries of this world, carrying not just silk and spices, but also knowledge and innovation. Yet, for all its vibrancy, it was a world fraught with challenges and uncertainties, a place where the unexpected was the norm. For Ibn Battuta, every step of the journey was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unyielding desire for discovery. As he prepared to leave Damascus, Ibn Battuta was acutely aware that his journey was far from over. The world was vast, and his thirst for knowledge insatiable. Ahead lay the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the spiritual heart of Islam and the original destination of his pilgrimage. But even as he looked towards the horizon, the lessons of North Africa lingered, lessons in patience, perseverance, and the power of human connection. With every mile and every encounter, Ibn Battuta was uncovering a world both familiar and foreign, a tapestry of human experience that transcended borders and bridged cultures. And so, with the sands of North Africa behind him and the promise of new adventures ahead, Ibn Battuta continued his epic quest, a journey that would take him to the farthest reaches of the known world and beyond. But that's a story for another time, as our intrepid traveller makes his way ever eastward, driven by a curiosity as boundless as the horizons he sought to explore. As Ibn Battuta left the familiar sands of North Africa and embarked on the next leg of his journey, the road ahead was as unpredictable as ever. He was headed towards the heart of the Islamic world, Mecca, before making his way to the Indian subcontinent, a land of promise, intrigue, and, if his luck held, gainful employment under the notoriously eccentric Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's a whole lot of ground to cover first. By the time Ibn Battuta reached Mecca, he was a seasoned traveller, having endured the trials of desert caravans and bustling city bazaars. The pilgrimage to Mecca, or Hajj, was the original influencer trip. Pilgrims from every corner of the Islamic world gathered, each with their own stories, and Ibn Battuta was no exception. He performed his religious duties at the Kaaba, mingled with scholars and mystics, and undoubtedly picked up a few more tales to jot down in his ever-expanding travelogue. Now, anyone who's ever travelled knows that the end of one journey often sparks the beginning of another. For Ibn Battuta, the Hajj was less a conclusion and more a launchpad into further adventures. After fulfilling his spiritual obligations, he set his sights on India, drawn by tales of wealth and opportunity. The 14th century Indian subcontinent was a tapestry of kingdoms and cultures, each more vibrant than the last. And at the centre of it all was Delhi, where Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq ruled with a style that was, shall we say, unique. Picture a ruler with the administrative finesse of a board game enthusiast who keeps changing the rules, often mid-game. Sultan Muhammad bin Tughluq was infamous for his ambitious projects and equally grand misfires. His reign was marked by one of the most memorable decisions in medieval history, the moving of his entire capital from Delhi to Dowlatabad, hundreds of miles away. Imagine trying to convince an entire city to pack up and move. With no moving trucks or Google Maps, mind you, it's the kind of logistical nightmare that makes even the most seasoned event planner break out in a cold sweat. But before Ibn Battuta could witness the Sultan's eccentricities firsthand, he had to get there. His journey from Mecca to India was no small feat, involving a perilous trek through the Arabian Peninsula, across the Arabian Sea, and into the bustling ports of the subcontinent. He travelled by land and sea, relying on a mix of caravans and ships. The sea routes were particularly treacherous, subject to the whims of monsoon winds and the occasional pirate attack. Sure, it sounds romantic, sailing the high seas and all, but in reality it was closer to a medieval version of Survivor, complete with seasickness and the constant threat of being marooned. Upon arriving in India, Ibn Battuta was greeted by a land as diverse as it was vast. From the spice-laden markets of Malabar to the majestic temples of Tamil Nadu, the subcontinent was a sensory overload. But it was Delhi, the seat of power, that drew him in like a magnet. A city of grand palaces and teeming streets, where the air was thick with the scent of incense and intrigue. It was a place where fortunes could be made or lost in the blink of an eye, where court politics were as tangled as the city's bustling bazaars. Ibn Battuta, with his keen mind and legal expertise, soon found himself in the employ of Sultan Muhammad bin Tughluq, who appointed him as a Qadian Islamic judge. Now, working in the Sultan's court was no walk in the park. It was more like navigating a minefield with the added challenge of deciphering the Sultan's whims. One moment you might be basking in royal favour, the next you could find yourself on the wrong side of a political intrigue. The Sultan's court was a vibrant, if volatile, mix of scholars, poets and power players, each vying for the Sultan's attention and patronage. But let's not sugarcoat it. The Sultan's penchant for grandiose projects often veered into the realm of the absurd. Take, for instance, his attempt to introduce a new currency made of brass and copper, intended to replace the precious metals in circulation. It was a bold move, reminiscent of trying to convince people that monopoly money could be used to pay rent. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take long for counterfeiters to flood the market, rendering the new currency about as valuable as a paperweight. Ibn Battuta's time in India was a whirlwind of experiences, from adjudicating legal disputes to navigating the labyrinthine politics of the Sultan's court. He witnessed the Sultan's notorious temper firsthand, a volatile mix of generosity and ruthlessness that could turn on a dime. Yet, amid the chaos, there was a method to the madness. The Sultan's projects, however ill-conceived, were driven by a vision of a unified and prosperous empire. It was a dream that was tantalizingly close, yet always out of reach. But let's take a moment to consider Ibn Battuta's own accounts of his travels. They are as much a product of his imagination as they are a record of his adventures. The line between fact and fiction often blurred in his writing, with Ibn Battuta not above a bit of self-aggrandizement. His descriptions of court life in Delhi are colourful, to say the least, and it's tempting to wonder how much was embellished for the sake of a good story. After all, who doesn't like to add a little flair when recounting their exploits? As Ibn Battuta navigated the complexities of life in India, he was acutely aware of the social and economic undercurrents that shaped the region. The Sultanate of Delhi was a melting pot of cultures, a patchwork quilt of communities, each contributing to the empire's rich tapestry. Trade routes crisscrossed the land, bringing goods, ideas, and people from as far afield as China and the Middle East. Yet, beneath the surface, there were tensions, between rulers and the ruled, between different religious communities, and between the promise of prosperity and the reality of poverty. And so, amid the chaos and colour of the Indian subcontinent, Ibn Battuta continued his journey. His time in India was a chapter filled with intrigue and adventure, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of a traveller who refused to be bound by the limits of his age. As he prepared to leave Delhi, the echoes of his experiences lingered, lessons in leadership, loyalty, and the unpredictable nature of life on the road. With the subcontinent in his rearview mirror, Ibn Battuta set his sights on new horizons, driven by the same insatiable curiosity and wanderlust that had propelled him from Tangier all those years ago. His journey was far from over, in fact. It was only just beginning. As he ventured forth into the unknown, the road ahead promised fresh adventures, new challenges, and, no doubt, more stories to tell. But those tales, dear listener, are for another day. Stay tuned as Ibn Battuta continues his epic quest, a journey of discovery that defies the limits of time and space, offering a glimpse into the world as it was and as it could be. With Ibn Battuta's insatiable curiosity still propelling him forward, his next itinerary had him making a pit stop in the Maldives, a place as idyllic as a travel brochure, but with a twist. In the mid-14th century, the Maldives wasn't just about sun, sand and sea. It was a thriving hub of trade, with its currency being a literal shell game. Cowrie shells, to be specific. Imagine trying to make change for a goat with a handful of seashells. It was a system that worked, somehow, in the same way that medieval economics often did, mysteriously and with a side of chaos. Now, Ibn Battuta wasn't just there to sunbathe. Almost immediately upon arrival, he found himself appointed as the chief Qadi, or judge, of the islands. Talk about a career plot twist. 1 minute you're navigating the high seas, the next you're knee-deep in local disputes over who owes whom a coconut. But while it may seem like a quaint position, being a judge in the Maldives was no walk on the beach. The islands were a melting pot of cultures and customs, a place where Indian, Arab, and African influences mingled like ingredients in a particularly spicy curry. Being a Qadi meant Ibn Battuta had to navigate these complex cultural waters, and let's just say the locals had their own unique set of rules. He was tasked with upholding Islamic law in a place where the traditional customs weren't always in sync with his teachings. Picture trying to convince a group of locals that their age-old practices needed a legal makeover. It was a bit like being a substitute teacher in a classroom of rebellious students, only the stakes were higher and the syllabus was written in sand. But our intrepid traveller wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. He took to his new role with the kind of gusto you might expect from someone who's been a wandering scholar for years. He implemented changes, some of which were accepted with open arms, and others, well, let's just say they required a bit more persuasion. The Maldivian society was matriarchal, with women wielding significant influence, a fact that Ibn Battuta found both fascinating and occasionally perplexing given his own cultural background. Yet, in typical Ibn Battuta fashion, he adapted, learned and sometimes just marvelled at the vibrant tapestry of life around him. While he was busy playing judge and cultural ambassador, the Maldives was bustling with economic activity. The islands were a crucial stop on the Maritime Silk Road, a network of trade routes connecting Asia, Africa and the Middle East. Traders passed through, exchanging goods like textiles, spices, and those all-important cowrie shells. This bustling trade brought prosperity to the islands, but it also meant the region was a hotbed of cultural exchange. Ideas, languages, and technologies flowed as freely as the tides, making the Maldives a microcosm of the interconnected medieval world. After a stint in the Maldives that was as colourful as it was chaotic, Ibn Battuta set sail for China, drawn by tales of the Middle Kingdom's grandeur. Now, if you think long-haul flights are exhausting, try a multi-leg journey across the Indian Ocean in a 14th century dhow. We're talking months at sea, with nothing but the stars to guide you and perhaps a few sea shanties to pass the time. But the promise of China was too enticing to resist, a land of silk, porcelain, and, as rumour had it, a giant bird that could lift an elephant. Spoiler alert, the bird was more myth than material, but it makes for a cracking good travel tale. When Ibn Battuta finally set foot in China, he was greeted by a world that was both familiar and alien. The Yuan dynasty was in full swing, and the capital, Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, was a city that could rival any in the world for its splendour and complexity. For Ibn Battuta, it was like stepping into a living tapestry, where every thread told a story of empire and innovation. The markets were a riot of colour and commerce, where traders from across Asia bartered for everything from jade to tea. The economic engine of China was a marvel to behold. The Grand Canal, a feat of engineering that would make any civil engineer weep with envy, connected the north and south, facilitating the flow of goods and ideas. Paper money, a concept that was still in its infancy in much of the world, was already in widespread use, and Ibn Battuta couldn't help but marvel at its efficiency. It was like discovering the medieval version of Venmo, only with more dragons and less digital security. Yet, amid this grandeur, Ibn Battuta found himself once again donning the judge's robe. It seemed the universe had a sense of humor when it came to his career path. In a land where Confucian ideals and Mongol rule mingled uneasily, Ibn Battuta was tasked with interpreting Islamic law in a context that was about as familiar as quantum physics is to a poet. It was a testament to his adaptability, a theme that ran like a golden thread throughout his travels. But let's address the elephant, or should we say, the giant bird in the room. Ibn Battuta's accounts of China occasionally veer into the realm of the fantastical. Stories of mythical creatures and lands of unimaginable wealth pepper his writings, leaving modern historians to wonder where fact ends and fiction begins. Yet, it's this blend of reality and imagination that makes his travelogue so compelling. It's like reading a medieval travel blog, where the line between personal anecdote and historical record is delightfully blurred. As Ibn Battuta navigated the complexities of Chinese society, he observed the cultural exchanges that were shaping the region. The Mongol rule had created an empire that was a melting pot of cultures, and the Silk Road was the artery that kept it all flowing. Ideas and innovations travelled alongside goods, with Chinese inventions like gunpowder and the magnetic compass slowly making their way to the West. It was a reminder that even in a world without instant communication, knowledge had a way of bridging the vastest of distances. Ibn Battuta's time in China was a whirlwind of experiences, from adjudicating legal matters to soaking in the rich tapestry of life around him. He marvelled at the architectural wonders, like the Forbidden City, which was as much a symbol of imperial power as it was a feat of human ingenuity. Yet, for all its wonder, China was a land of contradictions, where opulence and poverty existed side by side, much like the rest of the medieval world. As he prepared to leave China, Ibn Battuta carried with him not just the riches of experience, but a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of the world. His journey across the Maldives and China was a testament to the power of curiosity and the unyielding human spirit. It was a journey that defied borders and bridged cultures, offering a glimpse into a world both familiar and foreign, where every road led to new horizons. And so, with the vast landscapes of Asia behind him and the promise of further adventures ahead, Ibn Battuta continued his epic quest. His travels were far from over, and the road stretched out before him like an unspooled thread, leading him ever onward into the unknown. But those tales, dear listener, are for another time. Stay tuned as Ibn Battuta's Odyssey unfolds, a journey of discovery that continues to inspire and intrigue, even centuries later. And so, with the vast landscapes of Asia behind him and the promise of further adventures ahead, Ibn Battuta turned his gaze westward toward home. By now, he was something of a medieval rock star, minus the groupies and pyrotechnics, but with a collection of tales that would make any bard envious. But the journey back to Morocco was no simple homecoming. It was a trek across continents, through lands rich with their own stories, each adding another layer to the tapestry of his travels. In 1349, nearly 3 decades after he first set out, Ibn Battuta finally returned to Tangier. He was older, wiser, and arguably more exhausted than when he left. The city may have seemed smaller, or perhaps it was just that the world had grown infinitely larger in his absence. Now, let's crunch some numbers. Ibn Battuta had covered around 73,000 miles, visited over 40 modern countries, and crossed paths with countless cultures and civilizations. Not bad for a guy whose initial plan was a quick pilgrimage. But the return home wasn't just about ticking boxes on a medieval bucket list. Ibn Battuta had stories to tell, and boy did he tell them. His dictated travelogue, the Reeler, was a blockbuster of its time, a mix of fact, fiction, and everything in between. Imagine a medieval travel blog, complete with embellishments that would make even the most clickbait-hungry influencer blush. His tales of intrigue and sultans' courts, the exoticism of the Maldives, and the wonders of China were as much about capturing imagination as they were about recording history. Now, before we get swept up in the romance of his adventures, let's hit pause for a reality check. Ibn Battuta faced more than his fair share of hardships. Travel in the 14th century wasn't exactly a luxury cruise. Think grueling treks, questionable hygiene, and a constant game of will I or won't I catch dysentery today? His accounts, while fascinating, often gloss over the grit and grime, the constant threat of bandits, the political machinations of foreign courts, and the ever-present risk of disease were as much a part of his journey as the tales of adventure. Yet, for all its embellishments, the reeler remains an invaluable resource for historians. It's a window into a world on the cusp of change, a snapshot of a time when the globe was both endlessly vast and intricately connected. Ibn Battuta's travels coincided with a period of significant economic and political shifts. The Mongol Empire was fragmenting, trade routes were in flux, and the Black Death was looming on the horizon, poised to reshape societies in ways no one could foresee. His accounts provide a mosaic of these changes, seen through the eyes of a man who was both participant and observer. But what about the man himself? What drove Ibn Battuta to wander so far from home, to endure the privations and perils of travel? Part of it, surely, was the allure of adventure, a chance to see the world beyond the horizon. But there was also a deeper, more complex motivation at play. In an age where knowledge was as valuable as gold, Ibn Battuta's quest was a pursuit of learning, a desire to engage with the intellectual and spiritual currents of his time. As he settled back into life in Morocco, Ibn Battuta's legacy began to take shape. His travels had bridged cultures and fostered a greater understanding of the world as a connected whole. The reeler served as a testament to the breadth of human experience, a reminder that the search for knowledge and connection transcends borders. In a world still grappling with divisions, it's a message that resonates today. Yet, for all its significance, Ibn Battuta's legacy is not without its complexities. His accounts, while rich in detail, are also coloured by the biases and perceptions of his age. The romanticised view of distant lands and the occasional flights of fancy reflect not just the man, but the zeitgeist of the 14th century, a time when the exotic was both feared and revered. It's a dichotomy that continues to shape how we view history, reminding us to approach the past with a critical eye. Ibn Battuta's journey was more than just a physical odyssey. It was a testament to human curiosity and resilience, a journey that pushed the boundaries of what was known and possible. His tales, part truth, part embellishment, invite us to question the nature of storytelling itself. How do we separate fact from fiction? And does it matter when the stories themselves inspire us to explore beyond our own horizons? As the sun set on his travels, Ibn Battuta left behind a world forever changed by his journey. His path had woven through the fabric of history, leaving a legacy that continues to intrigue and inspire. In the end, his quest was not just about the places he visited, but the connections he forged and the stories he told. And while the gritty realities of his travels may have been swept under the rug, the romantic allure of his adventures endures. A beacon for those who, like him, are driven by an insatiable curiosity and the call of the unknown. So, dear listener, as you drift into dreams of distant lands and ancient tales, remember Ibn Battuta, the intrepid traveller who dared to chase the horizon and found a world more complex and interconnected than he could have ever imagined. His journey, a blend of romance and reality, reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is a journey without end, a quest that continues to shape our understanding of the world and our place within it. And with that, we wrap up this chapter of history, leaving you to ponder the adventures that await beyond your own doorstep. Safe travels, wherever your journey may lead. If you think your morning commute is rough, spare a thought for the ancient Polynesians. These folks weren't just hopping on a subway or stuck in a traffic jam. They were navigating across the Pacific Ocean, one of the most gigantic, unforgiving expanses of water on the planet, with nothing more than a canoe, a keen eye on the stars, and a brain packed with more information than your smartphone could ever handle. We're talking distances as jaw-dropping as 2,000 miles between some islands. That's like traveling from New York to Utah, except instead of a cozy road trip playlist, you've got the crashing waves and the occasional existential crisis about whether you'll ever see land again. Now, let's talk about why they even bothered. Polynesia is a staggering sprawl of islands scattered across roughly 10 million square miles of ocean. To put that in perspective, that's about 15 times the size of Alaska. But here's the kicker. Many of these islands are like lonely specks in a blue wilderness, with resources as scarce as a Wi-Fi signal in a basement. So, if you were an ancient Polynesian, getting from one island to the next wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. You needed to find new places to fish, gather food, and expand your community, all while ensuring you didn't end up a permanent resident of the open sea. In today's world, getting lost is mostly a matter of embarrassment. You might miss a turn and have to endure the passive-aggressive rerouting of your GPS. But for Polynesians, getting lost could mean the difference between life and death. Yet they managed to conquer the Pacific with a navigation system that would make any modern tech enthusiast green with envy. They didn't have Google Maps or GPS. They had the night sky, the ocean swells, and a memory that could recall the exact position of a constellation like it was yesterday's lunch order. Their methods were a blend of art and science, and they didn't just wing it by looking at the stars. These navigators understood the subtle cues of the sea, the way the waves moved, and how birds behaved. They were like human compasses, able to orient themselves in any direction, and they did it without a single digital interface. It's like they were the original multitaskers, managing to keep track of the stars, the swells, and their course, all while paddling for days on end. Now, here's where we bust a few myths. There's this romantic idea that they were just fearless adventurers setting sail with reckless abandon. But, reality check, they were skilled, calculated, and, most importantly, prepared. They had knowledge passed down through generations, a vast oral tradition that was as crucial as any modern navigation app. These weren't just joyrides across the ocean, they were meticulously planned voyages with real stakes. And let's not forget the boats themselves. These weren't your average canoes. They were sleek, double-hulled vessels built to withstand the open ocean's fury. Think of them as the sports cars of the sea, except powered by human endurance and ingenuity rather than fossil fuels. They were crafted with precision, designed to carry people and supplies over vast distances without capsizing or falling apart. The political and social factors driving this exploration were as complex as a soap opera plot. Chiefdoms were constantly on the lookout for new islands to settle and resources to exploit, which made maritime innovation not just a matter of survival, but a strategic imperative. This wasn't just about getting from A to B. It was about expanding influence, securing food sources, and ensuring the survival of the community. The stakes were high, and the navigators were the unsung heroes, the rock stars of their time, steering their people toward new horizons. So, next time you find yourself relying on GPS to get to the nearest coffee shop, remember the Polynesians. These navigators didn't just cross the ocean, they mapped it in their minds, turning the vast Pacific from a barrier into a bridge. They didn't just make history, they sailed right through it, leaving a legacy of maritime mastery that still baffles us today. And speaking of sailing right through history, let's dive into the nuts and bolts, or should I say, the wood and fibre of the Polynesian outrigger canoes. These weren't just any vessels. They were marvels of engineering, crafted with a kind of ingenuity that would make even modern engineers do a double-take. Imagine building a vehicle that can travel thousands of miles across the most hostile ocean on Earth, using nothing but natural materials. No steel, no engines, no GPS, just wood, fibre, and a lot of human sweat. At the heart of these canoes was the mighty koa wood, native to Hawaii. This wasn't just any wood, it was the VIP of the forest. Koa is praised for its strength and lightweight nature, making it the perfect backbone for these seafaring machines. It's like the carbon fibre of the ancient world, used to create a sturdy yet nimble vessel. But don't get too romantic about the idea of just walking into a forest and chopping down a tree. Harvesting koa was an art form, steeped in ritual and respect for nature. You didn't just grab an axe and go at it. There were prayers, chants, and a whole lot of tradition involved. It was about as far from your average trip to the hardware store as you could get. The design of these canoes was all about balance, literally. The outrigger, a lateral support float, provided stability in the roughest seas. It was like the training wheels for these oceanic bicycles, helping to keep the canoe upright against the relentless Pacific swell. Without it, you'd be more likely to capsize than reach your destination. This simple yet effective design allowed for speed and maneuverability that rivaled even some of today's most advanced boats. Imagine a sports car and a battleship had a baby, only this one could surf the waves with the grace of a ballerina. And then there was the coconut fiber, which wasn't just for making your tropical drinks look pretty. This humble material was twisted into ropes that lashed the canoe parts together. Think of it as the duct tape of the Polynesian world. Indispensable and surprisingly strong. Coconut fiber ropes resisted the salt and wear of the open ocean, a feat that would make modern synthetic ropes blush. The fact that these canoes held together in the wildest conditions using this natural binding is a testament to the resourcefulness of their makers. Now, let's have a reality check. The romantic image of Polynesians leisurely crafting their canoes under the palm trees doesn't quite capture the grind. Constructing these vessels was a community effort, requiring the coordination of skilled craftsmen, navigators, and labourers. It was a mini-economy in itself, with resources being gathered and allocated with precision. Chiefs often commissioned these canoes, using them as tools of power and influence, a bit like commissioning a private jet today. And just like modern aviation, it wasn't cheap. The labour and materials involved meant these canoes were investments, not just hobby projects. The social dynamics around these canoes were as intricate as their construction. Canoes were a symbol of status and prestige, and the ability to build and navigate them was a mark of honour. Navigators were the rock stars of their era, revered for their skills and knowledge. They held a special place in society, often enjoying privileges that others could only dream of. In many ways, these canoes were the glue that held Polynesian societies together, enabling trade, communication, and exploration. Let's debunk another myth while we're at it. There's this idea that Polynesians were just drifting across the ocean, going wherever the wind took them. In reality, their voyages were meticulously planned. These were not joyrides, but calculated expeditions with clear objectives, whether it was to find new land, establish trade routes, or scout for resources. Every journey was a high-stakes venture, where the success of the mission depended on the skill and knowledge of the crew. Failure was not just a setback, it could mean disaster for entire communities relying on these voyages for survival. So, next time you see a coconut, think beyond the beach bar. Imagine the countless hours of labour that went into crafting the ropes that held an entire canoe and a civilization together. Picture the koa tree standing tall, their wood destined to become the backbone of a vessel that could conquer the Pacific. These canoes weren't just boats, they were lifelines, cultural icons and engineering triumphs. They carried not just people, but the hopes, dreams and livelihoods of entire communities across an ocean that seemed infinite. As we delve deeper, remember that every piece of these canoes tells a story of human innovation and perseverance, a tale as vast and enduring as the ocean itself. Just when you thought the Polynesians' ingenuity couldn't get any more jaw-dropping, let's dive into their celestial navigation techniques. We're talking about a people who didn't just look up at the night sky and think, "That's pretty." Oh no, they studied the stars like they were cramming for finals, using them as their personal GPS to traverse the vast Pacific. Forget your smartphone's map app that struggles in a tunnel. These folks had a mental atlas that spanned thousands of miles, all stored in their heads. Talk about cognitive overload. Imagine setting sail under the stars, with the Milky Way as your roadmap. The Polynesians categorized stars into groups, like we do with street names, to guide their voyages. The backbone of night, as they called it, was a celestial highway directing them to far-flung islands. Stars like Sirius and Canopus weren't just points of light, they were beacons guiding canoes across the abyss. They knew the rising and setting points of dozens of stars, which basically meant they had a night sky version of Google Earth. And let's not forget the zenith stars, those directly overhead at specific islands, which functioned like celestial street signs. You could almost hear them saying, "You are here." But the stars weren't the only tools in their navigation arsenal. The ocean itself was a vast, undulating map. Polynesians were like ocean whisperers, interpreting the language of swells. Certain wave patterns known as te lapa could indicate the presence of land over the horizon. They'd feel the ocean's heartbeat through the hull of their canoes, discerning subtle differences in wave frequency and direction. It was as if they had a sixth sense, a sea sense if you will, allowing them to detect islands that were invisible to the eye. It's like having a Wi-Fi signal for land detection, but way cooler. Oh, and did I mention the birds? These navigators weren't just staring at the stars and feeling up the waves, they were also birdwatchers extraordinaire. Certain birds, like the frigate bird and the golden plover, were like the avian equivalent of highway signs. When these birds ventured further from land, Polynesians knew they were on the right track. And if the birds started heading back to shore in the evening, time to follow suit. These feathered friends were the original Google Maps, complete with turn-by-turn navigation. Now, let's pause and question the age-old myth of the noble savage, this idea that Polynesians were some kind of mystical, untamed beings communing with nature. Romantic, sure, but let's not kid ourselves. These people were highly skilled navigators who honed their craft through generations of observation, trial, and error. They didn't just throw themselves at the mercy of the elements, they mastered them. This wasn't blind faith, it was calculated risk, informed by a deep understanding of their environment. So, while the myth makes for a poetic narrative, the truth is far more impressive. They were the scientists of the sea, not just its poets. Fast forward to today, and there's been a resurgence in interest around these ancient navigation techniques. In an age where we're so reliant on digital navigation that losing a signal can induce a mild panic attack, the allure of celestial navigation has made a comeback. Some modern sailors are trading their electronics for sextants and star charts, in what can only be described as a hipster move for the nautical crowd. It's like swapping your Tesla for a horse-drawn carriage because you want to connect more with the journey. Sure, it's romantic, but let's be honest, it's also a bit like trying to churn your own butter in the age of supermarkets. Yet, there's something undeniably captivating about the thought of navigating by the cosmos, and it speaks to a deeper yearning for simplicity in our tech-saturated lives. In a world where every turn is dictated by a disembodied voice from our phones, the idea of relying on the stars and seas offers a kind of existential relief. It's a reminder that, even amid our digital clutter, some of the best tools are still the ones nature provided. However, it's worth noting that Polynesian navigation wasn't just about the journey. It was about survival, expansion, and the transfer of power. The ability to navigate the vast Pacific wasn't just a cool party trick, it was a cornerstone of their society. Chiefs and navigators held immense power, as they were the ones who could find new lands to settle and resources to exploit. In many ways, they were the venture capitalists of their time, investing in voyages that would yield new opportunities and wealth for their communities. So next time you're fiddling with your GPS, spare a thought for the Polynesians. They didn't just navigate the ocean, they conquered it with nothing but an acute understanding of the natural world. They remind us that true innovation often comes from working with what's around us, not against it. And while it's tempting to get swept away by romantic notions of the past, it's the hard facts and sheer skill of these navigators that truly deserve our admiration. As we continue this journey, remember that the Pacific wasn't just a sea to cross, it was a vast stage where the drama of human endeavour played out, one star at a time. Now, as we sail further into the maze of Polynesian society, let's peel back the layers of their social and political life, the real engine behind those epic voyages. While the romanticized image of a harmonious island paradise is about as accurate as a reality TV show, the truth is infinitely more compelling. You see, behind every successful voyage was a web of social dynamics and power plays that would make any political strategist sit up and take notes. Navigators in Polynesian societies were more than just skilled sailors. They were the rock stars, the elite, the ones you wouldn't mind crossing an ocean for. These navigators, known as PW, in some regions, held a status akin to royalty. Why? Because knowing how to read the stars and the waves was like holding the keys to the kingdom, or, in this case, the ocean. They were the gatekeepers of expansion, highly respected and often feared, as they could make or break a community's future with their skills. Think about it. If your entire civilization's survival depended on knowing which way was north without a compass, you'd probably treat these navigators like the celebrities they were. In fact, they often enjoyed perks that would make modern VIPs envious. They had access to the best resources, the choicest foods, and were often advisors to chiefs. Their societal role was less about the day-to-day and more about the long game, ensuring their people could find new lands to cultivate and call home. But let's debunk the myth of the idyllic island life. Have you ever tried living on a small piece of land in the middle of nowhere with limited resources? It's not all coconuts and sunshine. resource scarcity was a constant pressure cooker, fueling political power struggles that could turn any luau into a strategic conference. Chiefs, who were the political heavyweights, had to be savvy about resource management, which often meant making difficult choices about who got what and when. Economic context is critical here. In a world where land was limited and resources finite, every decision was a balancing act. The most successful chiefs were those who could secure new resources, either by trade or by sending out voyaging parties to locate new islands. This wasn't done on a whim, it was a calculated risk, a high-stakes game of expansion where the spoils could mean prosperity or ruin. Now, let's talk about the construction of those magnificent canoes. It was a communal affair, something that required the whole community to pitch in. You didn't just build a canoe in your backyard over a weekend. Oh no, this was a full-on production. Skilled craftsmen, known as tufunga, were responsible for shaping the canoes, but it wasn't just their show. It took a village, literally. Labourers, weavers, and even children had roles to play, from gathering materials to preparing food for the workers. It was like the ancient equivalent of a barn raising, except the barn had to float and withstand the ocean's wrath. The political dynamics were fascinating. Chiefs often commissioned these canoes, and their construction was a statement of power and prestige. They were more than transportation, they were symbols of status and technological prowess. Imagine commissioning a luxury yacht today. But instead of plush interiors, you're investing in the ability to navigate and conquer the Pacific. The labour, materials, and expertise required meant these canoes were economic investments as much as they were tools of exploration. But here's where we bust another myth. The notion of the noble savage, living in perfect harmony with nature, is as outdated as the idea that technology will solve all our problems. Sure, the Polynesians had an incredible respect for their environment, but they were also shrewd and pragmatic. They understood the harsh realities of their world and navigated them with precision. This wasn't about living in a paradisiacal bubble. It was about survival, plain and simple. Political power was often tied to one's ability to secure new resources, and this meant that the navigators who could deliver new opportunities were highly prized. Chiefs relied on them to maintain their influence, and in turn, navigators needed the support of their communities to embark on these voyages. It was a symbiotic relationship where both parties had much to gain and lose. And let's not forget the harsh realities of life on these islands. With limited arable land and resources, conflicts over territory weren't just common, they were inevitable. Political alliances were as fluid as the ocean itself, and power struggles could turn bloody. It wasn't all peace and love, sometimes. It was a matter of who could outmaneuver whom. The stakes were high, and the ability to navigate these complex social and political landscapes was as crucial as navigating the ocean itself. While it might be tempting to romanticize this time as one of unspoiled simplicity, the truth is far more nuanced. These were sophisticated societies with intricate social hierarchies, political machinations, and a deep understanding of their environment. So next time you're daydreaming about escaping to a tropical paradise, remember, real island life for the Polynesians was a delicate dance of diplomacy, skill, and strategy. It was a world where every decision mattered, and the ability to read the stars or build a canoe was not just a skill, but a path to power and survival. As we continue this journey, keep in mind that beneath the allure of the island, life lay a reality as challenging and complex as any civilization in history. And just like the vast ocean they conquered, the depth of their story is yet to be fully explored. While the allure of the island life might tempt you with visions of endless luaus and mai tais, the Polynesians' reality was more like a never-ending episode of Survivor, with fewer tiki torches and more existential stakes. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The legacy of these maritime maestros doesn't just linger in history books or in some dusty corner of a museum. Nope, it's alive and kicking, influencing modern navigation in ways you might not expect. Let's start with the basics. The Polynesian navigation techniques, honed over centuries, are making a splash in today's world of high-tech navigation. Take the hokulea, a modern replica of a traditional Polynesian double-hulled canoe. In 1976, it embarked on a 2,500-mile journey from Hawaii to Tahiti, using only traditional navigation methods, no GPS, no compasses, just good old-fashioned stargazing and wave reading. This wasn't just a nostalgic experiment, it was a statement. A reminder that these ancient techniques still hold water, pun intended, in our digital age. The voyage proved that ancient wisdom could triumph over modern gadgetry, and it reignited interest in traditional navigation skills. Now, in an era where we're all but surgically attached to our smartphones, you might wonder why anyone would bother looking up at stars when Google Maps is right there in your pocket. But here's the kicker. Relying on technology has made us a bit directionally challenged. Lose your phone signal, and suddenly you're more lost than a millennial without Wi-Fi. The resurgence of traditional navigation methods is, in many ways, a pushback against this digital dependency. It's a form of rebellion against the tyranny of touchscreen maps, a chance to reconnect with the world in a way that doesn't involve swiping left or right. And it's not just about navigation. The Polynesians' approach to boat building, too, has left a legacy that resonates in modern yacht design. The sleek, aerodynamic lines of those ancient canoes have inspired everything from competitive racing boats to eco-friendly marine engineering. The outrigger design, providing stability without sacrificing speed, is a concept that's as relevant today as it was back then. It's like the ancient Polynesians were whispering secrets of hydrodynamics across the centuries, and modern engineers are finally starting to catch on. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Polynesian navigation is its cultural impact. In a world increasingly obsessed with efficiency and speed, the Polynesian way of life offers a refreshing counterpoint. Their voyages were about more than just reaching a destination. They were about the journey, the connection to nature, and the stories told along the way. It's a perspective that challenges our modern obsession with getting from A to B as quickly as possible, encouraging us to slow down, look up, and perhaps even question what it means to truly navigate our lives. Yet, let's not get too misty-eyed here. The romantic myth of the noble navigator belies the harsh realities these sailors faced. Sure, they were skilled and courageous, but their voyages were fraught with danger. One wrong calculation could mean doom, and while the modern world is eager to romanticize their achievements, it's crucial to acknowledge the grit and determination behind the glamour. These weren't leisurely jaunts across the Pacific, they were survival missions, each one a calculated gamble with nature. In a way, the Polynesian navigators were the original tech disruptors, turning the vast, intimidating Pacific Ocean into a navigable highway. Their methods may seem primitive compared to the satellite systems we rely on today, but they remind us that sometimes the best solutions are those that work with nature, not against it. And as we grapple with the environmental challenges of the 21st century, this lesson is more relevant than ever. The Polynesians understood the ocean as a living entity, a partner in their voyages rather than an obstacle to be conquered. It's a perspective that might just hold the key to our own survival on this increasingly crowded planet. But let's wrap this up with a bit of humour. Here we are, in a world where our biggest navigation challenge is finding the quickest route to the nearest coffee shop, and we're taking lessons from people who crossed thousands of miles of open ocean with nothing but stars and sea swells to guide them. It's enough to make you chuckle, and maybe question whether our reliance on technology has come at the cost of losing something fundamental. Have we traded genuine exploration for convenience? Have we lost the ability to truly read the world around us, relying instead on devices that do the thinking for us? In our quest for efficiency, perhaps we've sacrificed a bit of the wonder and skill that made those ancient Polynesian voyages so remarkable. So next time you're tempted to curse your GPS for leading you astray, spare a thought for those ancient navigators. They didn't just map the Pacific, they charted a course through human ingenuity, leaving a legacy that challenges us to rethink our relationship with the natural world. In their sails, we find not just a history lesson, but a call to action, reminding us that the journey is just as important as the destination. And sometimes, the best map is the one we carry in our minds, not our pockets. Fidel Castro's story begins with a twist of irony that would make even the most jaded historians smirk. Born on August 13, 1926, in Brunel, Cuba, Fidel entered the world not with a revolutionary fist raised high, but rather cushioned by the comforts of privilege. His father, Castro, was a wealthy sugarcane farmer, a guy who'd made his fortune in an industry that would later become a target of Fidel's fiery rhetoric. Here's the catch-22. Fidel grew up in a household that enjoyed the spoils of capitalism while he plotted its demise. Now, Fidel wasn't just any rich kid with a dream. He had a knack for turning heads and causing a stir, even before he could spell proletariat. By the time he was heading to the University of Havana in 1945, he carried a mix of entitlement and ambition, like a cocktail shaken with equal parts youthful rebellion and academic curiosity. The university, a hotbed of political fervor, was his playground. And Fidel? Well, he was ready to play. In Havana, Castro found himself surrounded by political groups of every flavor, each more radical than the last. Here, he learned that if you wanted to make a name for yourself, you had to be louder, bolder, and, preferably, more controversial than your peers. Fidel, never one to shy from a challenge, took this to heart. He quickly became known for his fiery speeches, delivered with the kind of passion that could only come from someone who truly believed, or wanted everyone else to believe, that he was destined for greatness. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before he was the cigar-chomping revolutionary icon, Fidel was just another student, albeit one with a penchant for stirring the pot. He dabbled in law, but it was the politics department that truly captured his imagination. Here was a guy who saw law not as a career, but as a tool for social change, or, as he might have put it, a weapon against the imperialists. Now, to say Fidel's time at university was tumultuous would be like saying a hurricane is a bit windy. He plunged headlong into the political chaos of the time, aligning himself with the Ortodoxo party, which was founded by Eduardo Chibas, a man so dramatic he once shot himself during a live radio broadcast. Fidel absorbed the Ortodoxo spirit, which was essentially a blend of anti-corruption zeal and nationalist fervor, like a sponge soaking up the last drops of water in the Sahara. As Fidel's political ambitions simmered, he began to see himself as Cuba's future. He was the guy who believed he could challenge the status quo, and why not? He had the charisma, the education, and yes, the audacity to think he could pull it off. He participated in student protests, threw himself into debates, and generally behaved like a man on a mission that was still a bit hazy, but involved a lot of shouting and waving of arms. Despite his privileged background, Fidel was no stranger to the struggles of the common folk. He'd spent enough time among those who worked on his father's plantations to understand their grievances. This duality, born into wealth, yet sympathetic to the plight of the poor, became a cornerstone of his political identity. It was a paradox that he would exploit with the skill of a seasoned politician. Here's a fun fact. Fidel wasn't the only Castro with revolutionary tendencies. His brother, Raúl, was right there with him, proving that sometimes revolution runs in the family. While Fidel was making a name for himself in Havana, Raúl was quietly taking notes, ready to back his brother's every move, like the ultimate sibling support system, but with more grenades. Fidel's early years were not without their challenges. He was arrested multiple times for his political activities, a badge of honor in his eyes. Each arrest only fueled his determination, and each stint in jail became another chapter in his growing legend. For someone who'd grown up in the lap of luxury, he showed a remarkable resilience to hardship, a trait that would serve him well in the coming years. By the time Fidel left the University of Havana, he was a man on the brink of something big. He tasted the power of rhetoric and the thrill of activism. He had a vision for Cuba, albeit one that was still in its nascent stages. The privileged son of a sugarcane mogul was transforming into a revolutionary firebrand, complete with a burgeoning disdain for the very system that had afforded him his early comforts. The stage was set. Fidel Castro, the young man with a foot in two worlds, the opulence of his upbringing and the gritty reality of political activism, was ready to take on the establishment. He was about to become the embodiment of a revolution. But first, he needed to find his cause célèbre. Little did Cuba know, the storm that was Fidel Castro was just beginning to brew. As the winds of change began to swirl in Cuba, Fidel Castro was ready to dive headfirst into the storm. You see, Fidel wasn't just about shouting slogans and waving his arms. He was ready to move from rhetoric to action. It was 1953, and the young firebrand had his eyes set on a target that would make or break his revolutionary dreams, the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. Now, here's where things get interesting, or as some might say, a tad slapstick. Take a moment to consider this. The Moncada barracks was the second largest military garrison in Cuba, a veritable fortress brimming with soldiers, weapons, and enough barbed wire to make a porcupine envious. For most rational folks, attacking such a place with a ragtag group of about 160 armed men would sound like a suicide mission. But rationality was never Fidel's strong suit. Instead, he had audacity by the bucket load and a plan that could best be described as optimistic. On July 26, 1953, the day of the attack, Fidel and his motley crew of revolutionaries donned military uniforms in a bid to fool the guards. Spoiler alert, they weren't exactly the smoothest operators. The assault quickly turned into a chaotic melee, with gunfire ricocheting off walls and panic spreading like wildfire. In less than an hour, the attack was over, and it was a monumental failure. Fidel fled into the mountains, licking his wounds and probably wondering if he'd bitten off more than he could chew. But, as history would have it, this was merely the beginning of his legend. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. The Moncada attack was a disaster. Out of the 160 or so rebels, 61 were killed and many more were captured. Fidel, however, managed to escape, only to be caught a few days later. But here's where Fidel's story takes a turn worthy of any courtroom drama. During his trial, Castro transformed from a failed revolutionary into a master orator, delivering a defense speech that would echo through the ages. It was here that he famously declared, "History will absolve me." Talk about confidence. In a courtroom that was more theatre than law, Fidel's words were like a verbal Molotov cocktail aimed at the Batista regime. He painted himself not as a criminal, but as a patriot standing up against tyranny. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good David versus Goliath story? The jury, however, was less impressed by his theatrics and more by the hard facts. Fidel was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a move that Batista believed would silence him for good. But, as it turns out, Fidel in prison was like a match in a tinderbox, dangerous and ready to ignite at any moment. While jailed on the Isla de Pinos, now known as the Isla de la Juventud, Fidel's legend only grew. Imprisonment didn't break him, it solidified his status as a revolutionary icon. He used his time behind bars to write letters, refine his ideology, and rally support on the outside. Meanwhile, the Cuban economy was a mess, and Batista's regime was about as popular as a skunk at a garden party. The sugar industry was under pressure, foreign investments were shaky, and the gap between the rich and the poor was wider than ever. This economic discontent gave Fidel's revolutionary message an eager audience. Fidel's imprisonment was short-lived. Batista, in a move that can only be described as a political miscalculation, released him after less than 2 years in a general amnesty in 1955. This decision was akin to tossing a stick of dynamite into a campfire. Once free, Fidel wasted no time in rallying his supporters and plotting his next move. He headed to Mexico, where he met an Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara. Together, they began to plan the next chapter of their revolutionary saga. The Moncada attack, despite its failure, had put Fidel on the map. It was the spark that lit the fuse of a revolution that would eventually topple Batista's regime. But for now, Fidel was still gathering his forces, learning from past mistakes, and preparing for the next phase of his battle for Cuba's soul. The stage was set, and Fidel Castro was ready to step back into the spotlight with a new plan, a new team, and perhaps a slightly more thought-out strategy. Stay tuned, because the real fireworks were just about to begin. So, Fidel Castro found himself in Mexico, a country that had historically been a haven for political exiles and revolutionaries looking for a fresh start, or, in Fidel's case, a second wind. Think of it as a revolutionary rehab center with better tacos. It was here, amidst the bustling streets of Mexico City, that he crossed paths with a young, asthmatic Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara. Now, Che wasn't just any doctor. He was the kind of guy who viewed poverty, inequality, and injustice like a bull sees a red flag. He was itching for a fight, and Fidel had just the cause. Their meeting was like mixing two volatile chemicals, only without the safety goggles. Che was captivated by Fidel's vision for Cuba, and Fidel, well, he saw in Che a kindred spirit, someone who could match his firebrand rhetoric with an equally fiery intellect. The two bonded over their shared disdain for imperialism, capitalism, and, presumably, bad coffee. They talked late into the night, planning, dreaming, and undoubtedly fueling each other's revolutionary fervor with endless cups of café con leche. With Chi on board, Fidel began assembling a motley crew of Cuban exiles, all eager to topple Batista's regime. These weren't your typical soldiers. They were teachers, farmers, and students, united by a shared desire to see Cuba liberated from its dictatorial shackles. The plan was bold: sail from Mexico to Cuba, land in Oriente province, and spark a nationwide uprising. So began the infamous Granma expedition. Ah, the Granma. The name might conjure images of a cozy, rocking chair-bound elder gently knitting by a fireside, but this Granma was anything but. She was a 60-foot yacht, designed for a party of 12, but destined to carry 82 revolutionaries across the Gulf of Mexico. The Granma was overpacked with men, weapons, and enough idealism to power a small nation. It was less a boat and more a floating metaphor for biting off more than you can chew. On November 25, 1956, the Granma set sail from Tuxpan, Mexico, under the cover of darkness. It was supposed to be a 5-day journey. Spoiler alert, things didn't go as planned. Between the cramped quarters, seasickness, and the odd mechanical failure, the voyage was more Gilligan's Island than master and commander. Fidel and his merry band of revolutionaries finally landed in Cuba on December 2, 1956, but not before missing their intended landing date by 2 days. So much for punctuality. Arriving near Los Cayuelos in Oriente province, the group was immediately welcomed by the Cuban military, not with a red carpet, mind you, but with a barrage of bullets. "Welcome to Cuba, comrade." In the ensuing chaos, many of the would-be revolutionaries were killed or captured. Those who survived scattered into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, a rugged and inhospitable terrain that would become their home and their battleground for the next 2 years. Let's not sugarcoat the situation. Things looked bleak for Fidel and his band of guerrillas. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outsupplied. The Sierra Maestra was no picnic. It was a place where the landscape was as much an enemy as Batista's soldiers. But here's where things get interesting. This is where luck, charisma, and sheer audacity played a hand. Fidel's charisma was more effective than a megaphone at a protest rally. He managed to rally the support of the local campesinos who were fed up with Batista's oppressive regime and ready for change. These farmers and peasants provided food, shelter, and invaluable local knowledge. Fidel didn't just survive in the mountains, he thrived, turning adversity into a recruiting tool. His ragtag group grew into a formidable guerrilla force, one ambush, one skirmish at a time. The guerrilla warfare waged in the Sierra Maestra was a masterclass in asymmetrical combat. Fidel's forces, though small, were mobile and cunning, hitting Batista's troops where they least expected and then melting back into the jungle like ghosts. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a psychological one. Fidel knew that to win he needed the hearts and minds of the Cuban people, and his actions in the Sierra Maestra were meticulously designed to do just that. Meanwhile, Batista's Cuba was on shaky ground. The economy was in tatters, with sugar prices tanking and unemployment soaring. The regime was becoming increasingly unpopular, and Fidel knew how to capitalize on that discontent like a seasoned politician working a crowd. His radio broadcasts from the mountains, known as Radio Rebelda, spread his message far and wide, painting a picture of a just struggle against tyranny. Fidel Castro and his guerrilla army weren't just fighting a war. They were crafting a narrative, one that portrayed them as the underdogs standing up to the big, bad wolf of Batista's regime. And who doesn't love a good underdog story? By late 1958, the tide was turning, and Castro's forces were gaining momentum. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The revolution was far from over, and the path to victory would require more than just luck and charisma. In the Sierra Maestra, Fidel's forces learned to make do with less food, less ammunition, and less sleep. They became adept at using the terrain to their advantage, setting traps, and striking with the element of surprise. It was guerrilla warfare at its finest, and Fidel proved to be a master tactician, adapting to the ever-changing circumstances with a flexibility that would make a yoga instructor proud. So there you have it, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and a band of audacious dreamers, fighting not just for control of Cuba, but for an idea, a vision of a country free from corruption and inequality. As the battle raged on, The world watched, captivated by the unfolding drama in the Caribbean. The story of Fidel Castro was no longer just a tale of audacity and charisma. It was becoming a full-blown revolutionary epic, with all the twists and turns of a blockbuster movie. But the climax was yet to come, and the final act promised to be as riveting as the journey itself. Stay tuned, because the revolution was just heating up. As the revolution simmered like a pot about to boil over, the stage was perfectly set for Fidel Castro to ride the wave of change right into the heart of Havana. By New Year's Day, 1959, Battuta had fled the island faster than you could say adios, leaving behind a regime as stable as a three-legged chair. Fidel, the man who'd gone from a failed assault leader at Moncada to the darling of the Sierra Maestra, was now poised to take the reins of a country hungry for reform and democracy like a marathon runner craves water. The world watched with bated breath as Fidel and his bearded band of revolutionaries made their triumphant entry into Havana. It was the kind of homecoming that would make Hollywood directors weep with envy. Crowds lined the streets, showering the guerrillas with adoration, hope, and probably more flowers than a botanical garden in spring. Fidel, ever the showman, delivered speeches that promised a new era for Cuba, one of reform, democracy, and prosperity. The people believed him. Why wouldn't they? After all, nothing sells like the promise of a brighter tomorrow. But let's not get swept away by the rose-tinted glasses of revolutionary romance, because here's where the plot thickens faster than a poorly made gravy. With Batista gone, the proverbial keys to Cuba were now in the hands of Fidel and his Revolutionary Council. The first order of business? Overhaul a government that was as corrupt as a reality TV show voting system. Fidel promised elections, a free press, and an end to the decades-long cycle of authoritarianism. Spoiler alert, not everything went according to plan. The initial steps seemed promising. Land reforms were rolled out as if they were the latest iPhone model, redistributing property from the wealthy elite to the landless peasants. It was a move designed to dismantle the old power structures and, theoretically, level the playing field. The idea was sound, but the execution? Let's just say the devil's always in the details, or in this case, in the economic miscalculations. Fidel's government nationalized industries faster than you can say state control, which included taking over US-owned businesses. This move, while appealing to anti-imperialist sentiments, also sent foreign investors running for the hills. The US, not one to take things lying down, responded with trade embargoes that tightened around Cuba like a noose. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. Cuba was now an island, isolated not just by geography, but by politics. As the economy began to resemble a sinking ship, Fidel's promises of democracy started to evaporate like water in the Sahara. Elections? Those were postponed indefinitely. A free press? Only if your idea of freedom was agreeing with the government. Opposition parties? Silenced, banned, or exiled. It was as if Fidel had borrowed a page from the authoritarian playbook and then decided to write the rest of it himself. Here's a harsh truth wrapped in a charismatic mythos. Fidel Castro's grip on power tightened like a python around its prey. The idealism that had propelled him to power was slowly morphing into an authoritarian regime. Those who dared to dissent found themselves facing the full wrath of the revolution. Imprisonment, show trials, and in some cases, execution. The prisons filled with political prisoners faster than you could say counter-revolutionary. And yet, the myth of Fidel as a benevolent leader persisted, like a catchy song you can't get out of your head. It wasn't entirely without reason. He did oversee significant improvements in education and healthcare, turning Cuba into a model for social welfare. Literacy rates soared, and healthcare became accessible to all, achievements that were genuinely remarkable given the economic constraints. But these gains came at a steep price. Individual freedoms and political pluralism were thrown out like yesterday's garbage. By the early 1960s, it was clear that Fidel wasn't just Cuba's leader, he was its sole ruler. The revolutionary fervor that had once inspired hope now served to justify the consolidation of power. Fidel had become the very thing he once fought against, an authoritarian leader, albeit one with an impressive beard and a penchant for military fatigues. And what of the Cuban economy, you ask? It was about as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. The reliance on sugar exports, combined with the US embargo, left the economy limping along on crutches. Fidel turned to the Soviet Union for support, turning Cuba into a pawn in the Cold War chess game. The Soviets provided economic aid, but at the cost of aligning Cuba with communist ideologies that further alienated Western allies. So, was Fidel Castro a benevolent leader or a shrewd authoritarian? The answer, like many aspects of history, isn't black and white. He was both a liberator and a dictator, a visionary and a pragmatist. His revolution was a double-edged sword, cutting through the chains of Batista's tyranny only to forge new ones in the name of socialism. As Cuba trudged through the 1960s, it did so under the watchful eye of a leader who had become larger than life. Fidel Castro was no longer just a man, he was a symbol of resistance, of revolution, and, for some, of repression. The world kept watching, captivated by the enigmatic figure who had reshaped a nation and, in doing so, had become a part of the global narrative. The revolution was far from over, and the years to come would bring new challenges, new conflicts, and new chapters in the story of Fidel Castro. But for now, the stage was set for a tale of power, ideology, and the enduring struggle between myth and reality. The show, as they say, must go on. As the curtain falls on the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro's legacy stands at the crossroads of myth and reality, like a peculiar intersection where Che Guevara's iconic image meets the grim statistics of political repression. Castro, the charismatic leader who once promised democracy wrapped in the revolutionary red of his ideals, left behind a legacy as polarizing as pineapple on pizza. He was both a liberator and an oppressor, a beacon of hope for the disenfranchised and a nightmare for political dissidents. So, let's delve into the complex tapestry of Castro's enduring influence, both within Cuba's shores and far beyond. In Cuba, Fidel Castro's name is synonymous with the seismic shifts that rocked the island from 1959 onwards. His government, for all its faults, achieved social milestones that many developing nations envied. Literacy rates in Cuba soared from around 76% in 1959 to almost universal literacy by the early 1970s, a feat that even the most cynical observer would concede was impressive. Healthcare, too, became a hallmark of Castro's Cuba, with free medical services that led to an infant mortality rate lower than some wealthier nations, a fact that Castro's supporters waved like a victory flag. But before you cue the celebratory conga line, it's important to remember the cost at which these achievements came. Political freedom in Cuba became a relic of the past, locked away like a rare artifact in a museum. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, those neighborhood watch groups on steroids, kept an Orwellian eye on citizens, ensuring loyalty to the regime was as unwavering as a Havana sunset. Critics of the government either found themselves in prison cells or on makeshift rafts headed for Florida's shores, where dreams of freedom and prosperity awaited, assuming they survived the perilous journey. Economically, Castro's Cuba is a case study in contrasts. The reliance on sugar exports was akin to putting all your eggs in one very unstable basket. When the Soviet Union crumbled in 1991, taking with it the economic lifeline Cuba had relied on, the island was plunged into the special period, a euphemistic term for we're out of everything, including patience. During this time, GDP plummeted by over 35%, and shortages of food and fuel were as common as mojitos in a Cuban bar. Yet, somehow, the regime endured, an enigma wrapped in a mystery, delivered with a side of rice and beans. Internationally, Fidel Castro's legacy is as multifaceted as a Rubik's Cube. To some, he was a revolutionary hero, the David who stood up to the Goliath of American imperialism. His willingness to stick a cigar in the eye of the United States endeared him to leftist movements worldwide, from the jungles of Latin America to the turbulent streets of 1960s Paris. Castro's support for liberation movements in Angola and Vietnam, though controversial, positioned him as a global champion of anti-colonialism, a role he relished with the gusto of a man who knows he's making history. Yet, the romanticism of Castro's image often glosses over the darker chapters of his rule. The thousands of political prisoners, the state-controlled media, and the suppression of dissent are inconvenient truths that challenge the idealized narrative of the revolutionary hero. Fidel Castro was a master of public relations, a storyteller who could spin a yarn as effortlessly as he could light a cigar. His speeches, lasting hours on end, with theatrical performances that captivated audiences even as they concealed the grim realities of life under his regime. In the end, Fidel Castro left a legacy that is neither wholly villainous nor entirely virtuous. He was a product of his time, a man whose revolutionary zeal was as much a response to the injustices he witnessed as it was a reflection of his own ambitions. The dichotomy of his image hero to some, dictator to others, serves as a reminder that history is rarely as black and white as we'd like it to be. It's a spectrum where shades of grey often reveal more than the boldest colours. As we take a step back from the whirlwind of Castro's life and legacy, we're left pondering the true cost of revolution. Was the promise of equality worth the sacrifice of freedom? Can the social gains under Castro's rule justify the political repression that accompanied them? These questions, like the man himself, defy easy answers. But perhaps that's the point. Fidel Castro's story is a cautionary tale about the complexities of power, the allure of ideology, and the eternal struggle between myth and reality. So, as the sun sets on this chapter of history, we're left with a legacy as enigmatic as the man who forged it. Castro's Cuba, with its triumphs and tragedies, stands as a testament to the enduring power of revolution, a reminder that in the quest for change, the line between hero and villain is as thin as a Cuban cigar and just as combustible. The revolution may be over, but the debate over its legacy, much like the rumble of a classic car down Havana's Malecon, will continue for generations to come. In the bustling tapestry of early 19th century London, where soot-laden dreams mingled with the clanking of industrial ambition, a young engineer was about to make his first big splash, quite literally. Enter Isambard, Kingdom Brunel, a man whose name sounds like he should be leading a crusade or starring in a fantasy epic, but whose real-life exploits were far more captivating. Born in 1806, Brunel was the kind of guy who didn't just think outside the box. He redesigned the box, made it waterproof, and then tunnelled under the Thames with it. Speaking of tunnels, Brunel's early career was defined by one heck of an ambitious project, the Thames Tunnel. This was no mere hole in the ground, folks. We're talking about a 1,200-foot-long passageway, about 35 feet wide and 22 feet high, snaking its way beneath one of the world's busiest rivers. Imagine trying to dig a hole under Niagara Falls while a bunch of your workers were on strike and you're only half the way through. That's the kind of headache Brunel was dealing with, but with more water and less tourist merchandise. So how did a young Isambard get tangled up in this riverine escapade? Well, the project was actually the brainchild of his father, Marc Isambard Brunel, a French émigré with a penchant for bold ideas and a knack for engineering. Marc had this grand vision of connecting the north and south banks of the Thames, which back then was like trying to bridge the gap between two rival football clubs. The tunnel was supposed to revolutionize transportation and commerce, a kind of Victorian-era hyperloop. The plan sounded simple enough: dig under the river, build a tunnel, and voila! But the reality was more akin to a horror movie with a high body count. The Thames Tunnel was the first of its kind, and they were essentially making up the rules as they went along. Bugs in the process? You bet. Flooding was a constant menace, with water bursting through the tunnel walls like a earned lover at a wedding. In 1828, one particularly nasty flood nearly cost young Brunel his life and left his father scrambling for solutions that didn't involve supernatural intervention. Financially, the project was a sinkhole. The original budget of $160,000 ballooned to over $600,000, a sum that would make even today's politicians blush. The tunnel was funded through a mix of private investments and government loans, meaning it wasn't just Brunel's career on the line, but also the wallets of some very influential people. When the money started running out, public interest waned faster than a viral TikTok trend. But Brunel was not one to back down. He was determined to see this through, even if it meant risking it all on a subterranean gamble. Now, let's talk about the workers, the unsung heroes and occasional saboteurs of this grand venture. They were the ones down in the muck, day in and day out, dealing with conditions that would make a coal miner wince. But spirits were not always high, and strikes were as much a part of the tunnel as the bricks and mortar. In one memorable instance, workers downed tools and demanded better pay because apparently risking life and limb under a river should come with hazard pay. Who knew? Despite the setbacks, the project soldiered on, much like a contestant on a reality show who's clearly out of their depth but refuses to quit. The tunnel finally opened in 1843, a full 18 years after that first shovel hit the dirt. It was an engineering marvel, hailed as the eighth wonder of the world, but it was also a financial disaster, never quite recouping its costs. Yet, the Thames Tunnel set the stage for Brunel's career, establishing him as a man who could tackle the impossible, or at least try hard enough to make people believe he could. Brunel's story is a testament to the power of perseverance, audacity, and a dash of pure, unadulterated stubbornness. It's a reminder that behind every great feat of engineering is a team of underpaid workers, an overambitious budget, and a chap with a top hat who's willing to risk it all. In the end, the Thames Tunnel didn't just connect two sides of a river, it bridged the gap between dream and reality, a legacy that Brunel would carry with him as he moved on to even bigger and bolder projects. But that, dear friend, is a tale for another time. And so we saunter from the murky depths of the Thames Tunnel to the expansive dream of iron rails stretching from London to Bristol. If the Thames Tunnel was a perilous dive into uncharted waters, then the Great Western Railway was Brunel's moonshot, a grandiose leap into the future of transportation. This was a time when the word railway conjured images of noisy, soot-belching monsters that terrified horses and left the public clutching their hats. Yet Brunel envisioned something far more elegant, a railway that would glide across the countryside like a swan, albeit a swan made of iron and fire. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of this steel odyssey, let's set the scene. The year was 1833, and Britain was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution, a period marked by more grit and grime than a Dickens novel. London and Bristol, two economic powerhouses, were in desperate need of a speedy connection. Enter Brunel, who, with all the swagger of a man undeterred by his earlier financial misadventures, proposed a railway that wasn't just functional, but a thing of beauty. His plan was audacious, a railway stretching 16 miles, with tracks spaced an extravagant 7 feet and a quarter-inch apart, wider than the conventional gauge of the time. Why the wide gauge, you ask? Well, Brunel believed that a broader track would allow for smoother rides and higher speeds. This was the Victorian equivalent of insisting on first-class seating when everyone else was crammed into coach. Of course, this choice would later spark a gauge war, but for now it was just one of many bold decisions that defined Brunel's approach. He also envisioned this railway as part of a larger network, dreaming of a seamless journey from London to New York, via Bristol and a transatlantic steamship. Talk about ambitious. But every great dream requires cold, hard cash, and Brunel's railway was no exception. The initial budget was set at $2.5 million, a sum that could buy you a small European principality back then. Investors were courted with promises of speedy returns, and the public was wooed with visions of a modern marvel. Still, skepticism abounded. People were wary of these newfangled machines, fearing that speeds over 30 mph might cause insanity, or at the very least a bad case of windburn. Yet Brunel pressed on, unfazed by the naysayers. Now, let's talk about the pied de resistance of this entire endeavour, the box tunnel. This was not just a hole through a hill, it was a testament to human ingenuity, and perhaps a touch of madness. The tunnel was to be 1.75 miles long, slicing through Box Hill like a knife through a particularly stubborn fruitcake. Its construction was a monumental challenge, requiring more than 4,000 workers and an array of cutting-edge techniques, including the use of gunpowder for blasting through stubborn rock. It was a grand spectacle, like a fireworks display, but with more rubble and fewer oohs and ahs. As the budget ballooned faster than a Victorian waistline, the project became a hotbed of controversy. Costs soared to over $6 million, prompting heated debates in Parliament and among the public. Yet, Brunel remained undeterred. The tunnel was completed in 1841, after nearly 6 years of grueling labour. But here's the twist. Brunel designed the tunnel so that on his birthday the rising sun would shine straight through it, an audacious display of both engineering prowess and ego. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with the Great Western Railway. Landowners grumbled about the intrusion of noisy trains through their pastoral landscapes, and the public remained divided on whether these iron beasts were the future or a fleeting folly. But Brunel had a knack for turning skeptics into believers. By the time the railway officially opened in 1841, it was hailed as a triumph of modern engineering. Trains zipped along the tracks at a dizzying 50 mph, leaving doubters eating their words in soot. Yet beneath the triumph lay a complex web of challenges. The wide gauge, while innovative, created compatibility issues with other railways, leading to logistical headaches and added costs. And while the railway was a commercial success, it was never quite the financial goldmine investors had hoped for. But Brunel wasn't just building railways, he was laying the groundwork for a new era of transportation. His vision was one of interconnectedness, a world where distance was no longer a barrier to progress. As we pause this historical journey, it's clear that Brunel's story is one of ambition, innovation, and a healthy dose of audacity. He was a man who dared to dream big, unafraid to challenge conventions and push the boundaries of what was possible. The Great Western Railway was more than just a means of getting from point A to point B. It was a symbol of a new age, one that embraced technology and the promise of the future. And like all great stories, Brunel's tale is far from over. There are more feats of engineering genius to explore, more myths to debunk, and more lessons to learn from this indomitable spirit. But for now, let's leave Isambard Kingdom Brunel standing on the platform of history, a conductor of dreams, ready to ride the rails of his own imagination into the annals of greatness. And so, with the Great Western Railway steaming ahead at a brisk pace, Brunel set his sights on an oceanic adventure that would redefine maritime history. Into the SS Great Britain, a ship so ahead of its time it made the Titanic look like a wooden rowboat. This wasn't just any seafaring vessel. This was the world's first iron-hulled, propeller-driven steamship, a floating testament to Brunel's knack for turning the impossible into reality. Now, let's set the scene. It's the early 1840s, and the world is in the throes of the Industrial Revolution, a time when everything could be improved with a dash of steel and a sprinkle of steam. The Atlantic Ocean was the freeway of its day. But the ships? Well, they were the Model T Fords compared to Brunel's vision of a luxury sports car. Wooden hulls and paddle wheels were the status quo, but Brunel had a different idea. Iron was his material of choice, and he was betting big on it like Vegas Strip big. The SS Great Britain was not just a ship, it was a gamble of epic proportions. Brunel was banking on iron to be lighter, stronger, and, let's face it, cooler than wood. But this was a time when iron ships weren't just revolutionary, they were considered sheer madness. After all, who would want to sail inside a giant metal coffin? But Brunel, ever the visionary, saw the future in iron's gleam. Construction began in 1839 at the famous Bristol Dockyard, a place that would soon become synonymous with financial hemorrhaging. The dockyard alone was a marvel, and an expense that would make even the most frivolous spenders squirm. Imagine a project so costly it makes the latest Hollywood blockbuster look like a student film budget. That's the kind of financial black hole we're talking about. The dockyard was custom-built to accommodate the behemoth that was the SS Great Britain, and costs spiraled from an estimated $100,000 to over $200,000. In today's money, that's a staggering sum that could buy you a fleet of luxury yachts and still leave enough for a modest island. But hey, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few banks, right? Or at least, that's what Brunel seemed to believe. The construction of the SS Great Britain was a symphony of innovation and improvisation. At 322 feet long and 3,400 tons, she was a leviathan of the seas. Her iron hull was a bold statement, a middle finger to the wooden ships of yore. And then there was the propeller, a radical departure from the paddle wheels that had powered steamships until then. Brunel wasn't just making a ship, he was crafting a revolution. Of course, betting on iron and propellers wasn't without its challenges. The world wasn't quite ready to let go of its love affair with wood. Skeptics balked at the idea of an iron ship, fearing it would sink like a stone. There were whispers that a ship made of iron would disrupt compasses and therefore navigation. A myth with all the scientific credibility of believing that the moon is made of cheese. But Brunel pressed on, armed with more determination than a bulldog with a bone. Now, it wouldn't be a Brunel project without a few financial hiccups. The SS Great Britain was a colossal investment, and the money pit that was the dockyard only added to the financial strain. Investors were getting twitchy, and the pressure was on. But Brunel was the kind of guy who could sell ice to Eskimos, or in this case, iron ships to skeptics. He was a master of persuasion, weaving tales of a future where iron ships would rule the waves, transporting cargo and passengers faster and more efficiently than ever before. And so, in July 1843, the SS Great Britain was launched. It was a grand affair, complete with a champagne bottle smashing against the hull and a crowd of onlookers who were either in awe or in shock, or a bit of both. The launch was a success, and the SS Great Britain began her maiden voyage with all the pomp and circumstance of a royal wedding. But here's where reality checks in with a healthy dose of irony. The ship promptly ran aground on the sands of Dundrum Bay in Ireland. Turns out, even Brunel's genius couldn't escape the occasional hiccup. The grounding was a moment of sheer panic, but Brunel, ever the optimist, saw it as a minor setback. The ship was eventually refloated, and the SS Great Britain went on to become a transatlantic triumph, shuttling passengers and cargo between England and America with a speed and style that left its competitors in its wake. Yet, despite its engineering brilliance, the financial returns were as elusive as a unicorn. The ship never quite made back its massive investment, a recurring theme in Brunel's career. But financial woes aside, the SS Great Britain was a game-changer. She proved that iron ships were not only viable, but superior. Her design influenced shipbuilding for decades, setting the standard for the iron giants that would soon dominate the seas. And while Brunel didn't live to see the full impact of his innovation, his legacy sailed on. Literally. The SS Great Britain remains preserved today as a tribute to one man's audacious vision and the audacity that fueled the Industrial Revolution. Yet, beneath the triumphs lay a sobering truth. Innovation often comes at a steep price, one that's measured not just in pounds and pence, but in sleepless nights and relentless ambition. Brunel was a dreamer, a doer, and occasionally a debtor. But he was also a reminder that progress is rarely a straight line. It's a series of bold leaps and blind faith peppered with the occasional stumble. As we wrap up this chapter of Brunel's maritime exploits, it's clear that his story is far from over. There are more tides to navigate, more myths to shatter, and more lessons to learn from a man who dared to challenge the status quo. So stay tuned, dear friends, for the next installment in the saga of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a tale of steam, steel, and the indomitable human spirit. So, where were we? Ah yes, sailing the high seas with Brunel's SS Great Britain, a ship that might as well have been dubbed the Iron Giant's little sibling. But if you thought Brunel was done flexing his engineering muscles, you're in for a treat. Enter the SS Great Eastern, a ship so massive it made its predecessors look like bathtub toys. This was Brunel's magnum opus, his piece de résistance, and, spoiler alert, the source of his ultimate downfall. Picture this. It's the mid-1850s, and Brunel's not content with merely crossing the Atlantic. No, he wants to conquer it and then some. His latest brainchild is the Great Eastern, a leviathan designed to transport 4,000 passengers and enough coal to reach Australia without stopping for a pit stop. It was the Victorian equivalent of a non-stop flight from London to Sydney, but instead of reclining seats and in-flight movies, think cramped quarters and coal dust. Now, if you're wondering about the size of this beast, let me paint a picture with numbers. The Great Eastern was 692 feet long, which, for the mathiverse, is roughly the length of 2 football fields laid end to end. We're talking about a ship that displaces about 22,500 tons. And because Brunel never did anything by halves, it featured not one, but 2 propulsion systems, a screw propeller and paddle wheels. The ship was essentially the Swiss Army knife of the sea. A little bit of everything, just in case. The idea was ambitious, too ambitious some might say, but Brunel wasn't one to let practicality stand in the way of a good idea. The Great Eastern was meant to revolutionize maritime travel, serving as a floating city capable of connecting the far reaches of the British Empire. However, this grand vision came with a price tag as hefty as the ship itself. The initial budget of $500,000 ballooned to over $1.5 million, a number that could make even today's mega projects look like pocket change. But wait, there's more. Financial ruin was just the tip of the iceberg. The Great Eastern was plagued by technical challenges that would make a lesser man throw in the towel. The ship was so large that existing docks couldn't accommodate it, necessitating the construction of a special launch site along the Thames. And speaking of launches, the initial attempt to get this behemoth into the water was a fiasco of epic proportions. Instead of a triumphant splash, the Great Eastern merely shuffled sideways like an indecisive crab. It took 3 months and more than a few strained backs to finally coax it into the Thames. As if technical woes weren't enough, Brunel's health was on a downward spiral, much like the budget for this project. Years of relentless work, financial stress, and the weight of expectations took a toll on his body. By the time the Great Eastern was ready to set sail, Brunel was a shadow of his former self, battling illness with the same stubbornness he applied to engineering challenges. Despite the setbacks, the Great Eastern embarked on its maiden voyage in 1859 amidst a mix of public awe and skepticism. It was a spectacle, no doubt, but not the smooth sailing Brunel had envisioned. The ship's size made it difficult to maneuver, and its dual propulsion systems were more trouble than they were worth. Even with its impressive dimensions, the ship was plagued by mechanical issues, including a boiler explosion that, thankfully, didn't result in serious casualties but did little to inspire confidence. The Great Eastern was a financial disaster, never fulfilling its intended purpose as a passenger liner. Instead, it found a second life as a cable-laying ship, playing a crucial role in laying the first transatlantic telegraph cable. But by then, Brunel was no longer around to see the silver lining. He passed away in 1859, just days before the ship's maiden voyage, leaving behind a legacy as grand as it was complicated. So, what do we make of Brunel's great white whale? The Great Eastern was a testament to human ambition, a monument to the idea that bigger is always better, until it isn't. It was a marvel of engineering, yes, but also a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching. Brunel's vision was ahead of its time, a reminder that even the brightest minds can sometimes be blinded by their own brilliance. In the end, the Great Eastern wasn't just a ship, it was a symbol of the age, a reflection of an era when anything seemed possible, even if reality had other plans. It's easy to romanticize the past, to view Brunel as a visionary unencumbered by the mundane constraints of feasibility. But the truth is, his story is as much about failure as it is about success, a balance of dreams and the harsh wake-up calls that often accompany them. As we leave the Great Eastern behind, it's worth pondering the lessons it imparts, not just for Brunel, but for all of us. Ambition is a double-edged sword, capable of cutting a path to greatness or leading us into the treacherous waters of hubris. Brunel's life was a testament to the power of daring to dream big, but also a reminder that sometimes the biggest dreams come with the steepest costs. And with that, we'll set sail for the final chapter of Brunel's saga, where we'll explore the lasting impact of his work and the legacy he left behind. There are more stories to uncover, more myths to debunk, and more truths to confront about a man who dared to bridge the gap between the possible and the impossible. So stay tuned as we continue to navigate the fascinating waters of history, one bold venture at a time. And so, with the Great Eastern's tale echoing through the annals like a cautionary sea shanty, we drift toward the shores of Isambard Kingdom, Brunel's legacy, a place where myth and reality swirl like tea leaves at the bottom of a Victorian porcelain cup. How does one reconcile the image of Brunel as both a revered icon of engineering and a man whose bold ventures often teetered on the brink of financial catastrophe? Well, my friends, it's all about perspective, a bit like looking at a Monet painting up close versus from a distance. Up close, you see the chaotic dabs of colour. Step back, and you see a masterpiece. Brunel's story is a testament to the allure of genius wrapped in the unpredictable cloak of human ambition. Sure, he had his share of spectacular misfires, those budget-busting behemoths we've come to know and love. But let's not forget the footprints he left on the sands of time. Start with the Thames Tunnel, which, despite its financial woes, laid the groundwork for modern urban transport systems. In fact, it's still in use today as part of the London Underground, proving that sometimes a soggy start doesn't preclude a solid finish. Then there's the Great Western Railway, a project that practically screamed Victorian extravagance with its wide-gauge and audacious engineering. Sure, it didn't yield the financial windfall investors hoped for, but it transformed travel between London and Bristol, slashing journey times and fueling economic growth. By the late 19th century, railways had become the arteries of Britain, pumping life into trade, commerce, and the very idea of mobility. It's the kind of legacy that makes you wonder if Brunel had a crystal ball stashed beneath his top hat. And the ships? Oh, those magnificent metal leviathans that either sailed into history or grounded in infamy. The SS Great Britain and the Great Eastern might not have been cash cows, but they were definitely trendsetters. The SS Great Britain's iron hull and screw propulsion set the template for modern shipbuilding, a testament to Brunel's uncanny knack for spotting the future even while his projects floundered in the present. The Great Eastern, despite its tumultuous start, helped lay the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable, effectively shrinking the world long before the internet was a twinkle in anyone's eye. Now, let's talk numbers, because what's history without a bit of arithmetic to keep us grounded? The economic ripples of Brunel's projects were both vast and varied. The Great Western Railway, for instance, cost over $6 million to complete, an eye-watering sum that would make any modern-day accountant reach for a stress ball. Yet, it stimulated industries along its route, from coal mining to manufacturing, contributing to the economic dynamo that was Victorian Britain. But here's the rub. Brunel's projects were less about immediate financial returns and more about long-term vision. They were the moonshots of their day, driven by the belief that progress often demands a leap of faith, a leap that sometimes lands you in a puddle, but occasionally, just occasionally, sets you on the path to greatness. And while Brunel wasn't around to see many of his ventures bear fruit, his fingerprints are all over the infrastructure we take for granted today. So, where does this leave us on the myth versus reality scale? Brunel's life is a prime example of the thin line between genius and madness that often characterizes the great innovators of history. He was a man who dared to dream on a scale few could fathom, even if those dreams sometimes resembled nightmares for his financiers. It's easy to romanticize his story, to see him as the quintessential Victorian hero, tilting at the windmills of convention with an unflappable belief in the power of engineering. But it's just as important to recognize the human cost of such ambition, the sleepless nights, the financial strains, the relentless pressure to deliver on promises that often teetered precariously on the edge of possibility. Brunel's legacy is a reminder that progress is rarely a straight line. It's a zigzag of experiments, failures, and occasional triumphs that require both grit and grace to navigate. His story is a testament to the idea that true innovation often demands a willingness to embrace uncertainty, to risk everything on a vision that others might dismiss as folly. It's a narrative that still resonates today in a world where the line between technological breakthrough and financial disaster is as thin as ever. In the end, Brunel's enduring appeal lies in his audacity, a quality that, for better or worse, defined his era. He was a man who refused to be bound by the limitations of his time, who saw the world not for what it was, but for what it could be. And perhaps that's why his name endures, why he remains a towering figure despite the wreckage of his more grandiose plans. Brunel embodies the spirit of an age that dared to dream big and fail bigger, a spirit that still inspires those who seek to push the boundaries of the possible. So, as we close the book on Isambard Kingdom Brunel, let's remember him as a man of contradictions, a visionary with feet of clay, a dreamer whose dreams sometimes outpaced reality, yet ultimately a pioneer who helped shape the modern world in ways that continue to ripple through time. His story is a reminder that history is written not just by the victors, but by those who dared to challenge the status quo, who took risks and faced the consequences with a mix of courage and chutzpah. And if nothing else, Brunel's life is a masterclass in the art of thinking big, a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in his time.